I uncapped my dead wife's fountain pen to write thank you notes on the morning of her memorial, and knew before the nib even touched paper that another hand had used it. It was not anything dramatic. No smear of ink, no crack in the barrel. Just the angle of the cap turned on too hard, and the faint drag in the repaired gold nib when I tested it on the corner of an envelope. Eleanor had written with that pen for 23 years. I had watched her hold it through sympathy notes, Christmas cards, promissory little reminders to herself, and the neat impossible lists by which she kept our family from dissolving into weather. She always cleaned the nib with a soft square of old undershirt cloth and capped it with a light turn of the fingers, never tight enough to make a man feel he was opening a jar. Whoever had used it last had pressed too firmly and cleaned it carelessly. I stood there in the den with the envelope in one hand and the pen in the other, and felt something small and cold move through me that had no business being there on the day we were meant to honor my wife. The den still smelled like lilies from the funeral home spray stands and the coffee I had forgotten on the side table 40 minutes earlier. Morning light came through the west windows, thin and gray-blue, not yet committed to being day, and fell across Eleanor's writing desk in the way I knew as well as my own name. There were grooves in that desk where her wedding ring had tapped the wood over years of note writing. A pale square where the old brass lamp had sat before I moved it 3 inches left after she got sick because she said the glare was catching her eyes. The little glass dish for stamps, the ivory letter opener with the cracked handle, the stack of condolence cards and envelopes I had arranged after breakfast, just as she would have done it. Or I believed I had. I put the pen down and looked again at the cards. There were 12 on the desk, cream stock with a border so faint you saw it only when you tilted the paper. Eleanor had bought them in boxes of 50 from a stationer in Upper Arlington 20 years ago and never once deviated. A thank you note shouldn't look festive, she used to say. It should look like somebody sat down and meant it. She stacked them in groups. Family first church, second neighbors third, and tucked the addressed envelopes beneath each pile so the top card in any stack was always blank and ready. What lay on the desk that morning was almost right, close enough that another man might have sat down and written into it without thinking. But the family cards were on the right instead of the left, and the envelopes were face up under the church pile, and the stamps were gone from the little dish and laid in an untidy strip beside the lamp as though somebody had started a task and then wandered off halfway through. I stood looking at the arrangement longer than I care to admit. Grief does that to a man. It makes him solemn about nonsense. I knew that, and I told myself so. You bury your wife on a Thursday. The house fills with casseroles and shoes and low voices and the smell of cut flowers, and by Saturday morning the placement of stationery can feel like judgment from another world. I had been sleeping badly and waking before light with the terrible clean knowledge that she was still dead. There are mistakes grief makes in the mind. It enlarges details until they carry a weight they cannot possibly deserve. I knew all that. Still, I moved the cards back to the left, slipped the envelopes face down where they belonged, and looked for the stamps. They were in the second drawer under the desk, still on their sheet. I remember that, because the drawer gave its little wooden catch when I opened it, and the sound of it was so exactly Eleanor that for one humiliating second I had to sit down before my knees decided for me. She had always hated when I overfilled drawers. Things ought to close without argument, she used to say, and there are phrases you think are only about household management until the person who said them is dead, and the whole house begins speaking in their voice. The notepaper trembled a little under my hand as I sat. I picked up the pen again and wrote the date in the upper right corner of the first card, March 14th. The nib scratched harder than it should have. Not enough to ruin the line, just enough to make me feel the pressure of whoever had last held it. I turned the envelope over and stopped. There, written on the back flap in blue-black ink, was one of Eleanor's small practical marks. A diagonal line meaning the address had been checked against the church directory, except it was not hers. The line was too steep. Eleanor made hers low and lazy, almost like a sigh. This one looked deliberate, earnest, learned. I stared at it until the coffee on the side table gave off that cold, bitter smell coffee gets when it is no longer a drink, but evidence of time passing. From the kitchen came the soft hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock above the mudroom door. Somewhere overhead in the guest room where Mara would sleep if she decided to stay the night after the memorial, the old floorboard near the window let out a dry little pop as the house adjusted to morning. The furnace had not yet kicked on, and the hardwood beneath my slippers held that late winter chill that comes up through the soles and reminds you Ohio is still deciding whether spring has earned the trouble. The smell in the den was paper coffee lilies and the faint medicinal trace of furniture polish from where I had wiped the sideboard after supper because it was easier than sitting in the chair by our bed and looking at the place her robe no longer hung. I wrote 3 lines of a thank you note and crossed out the last because I had started to write "We are grateful" instead of "I am grateful." That hurt more than it should have. I set the card aside and got up to refill my mug. The kitchen was as Eleanor had left it in spirit and not at all as she had left it in fact. That is marriage after death, I think. The spirit remains longer than the arrangement. Her striped blue dish towel hung over the oven handle, though I had folded it there last night with more care than I would once have thought possible for a dish towel. The bread box was empty because people had brought enough rolls and tea loaves and coffee cakes to provision a church basement, and the smell of yeasted sweetness still clung to the room from the loaves on the counter. Through the window over the sink, I could see the side yard wet from overnight drizzle. The mulch around Eleanor's hostas dark as coffee, grounds the old maple not yet in leaf but wearing that reddish haze that means it is thinking about it. I poured what was left in the coffee pot into my mug and took it black because Eleanor had always said milk in reheated coffee was surrender. The pantry door stood half open. On the inside of it hung the family calendar, one of those large monthly pads Eleanor had bought at the office supply store every January for as long as I can remember. She wrote in a compressed, neat hand, blue for church, black for family, green for bills and appointments, red only for birthdays or things impossible to move. Since her death, I'd been trying to keep up with it, not because I needed the calendar so much as because the shape of her days still looked like sanity to me. I sipped the coffee and glanced at the square for Monday. There in green ink were the words, 10:30, Dr. Park, cognition check. I stood quite still in front of the pantry door. The mug was warm in my hand. The kitchen clock ticked. A delivery truck passed somewhere out on Bryden Road with that hollow boxy rattle they all have in the morning, and the sound seemed to come from a long distance away. I looked at the note again, then at the square for Tuesday, then back to Monday. Dr. Park was my physician, yes. Eleanor's too after her old internist retired. But I had not made any appointment for Monday, and certainly not for something called a cognition check. I set the mug on the counter and stepped closer. The ink was the same blue-green Eleanor preferred for practical entries, but the downstrokes were heavier, and the tail of the K in Park was too long. Not wrong enough for a stranger to catch, not right enough for me to miss. I put my hand on the edge of the pantry door. It was ridiculous how cold my fingers had gone. Then the doorbell rang. There is a particular fatigue that comes over a house before a funeral or memorial, a kind of formal exhaustion that is not yet sadness because there is too much to do. That fatigue came into my chest with the bell. I told myself the calendar note could be a misunderstanding, something Daniel had mentioned perhaps, or one of those routine follow-ups doctors suggest after a major family event. I had not been myself these 2 weeks. That was true enough. I had misplaced my glasses twice and yesterday found the butter in the cabinet over the stove where nobody had any business putting butter. Mara had laughed gently and said it was because the house was full of people. Daniel had said, "Dad, you've got to eat more, all right? You get foggy when you don't." It was possible I had agreed to something and forgotten. Possible and therefore not yet frightening. I opened the front door to find Daniel on the porch with a florist's white cardboard box under one arm and his leather portfolio in the other hand. He was wearing the charcoal suit he had bought for Eleanor's visitation, the one with the faint check in it that made him look both younger and more authoritative than his years when he stood straight. He had his mother's coloring, or what had once been his mother's coloring before illness took some of it from her dark blonde hair, gone a little sandy at the temples, clear skin eyes that from a distance looked gentle and up close tended to sharpen when he listened. At 43, he had the polished, tired look of men who spend their days organizing other people's delays and then come home feeling indispensable. He kissed my cheek with a quick, dry pressure and stepped inside before I had moved fully back from the threshold. "Morning," he said. "Flowers for the guest book table." "Did the caterer call Num?" "They called me at 7. They're still bringing the hot trays at 11:30 instead of 11. I told them that's fine." He had already crossed into the front hall while he spoke and was looking toward the living room where the memorial photographs were arranged on card tables against the wall. I closed the door and turned to watch him set the florist's box on the runner bench beneath the hall mirror. "How did you know about Monday?" I said. He glanced at me. "Monday. Appointment with Dr. Park." "Oh." He reached into the portfolio without urgency, as if the answer were filed under something obvious. "I talked to her nurse Thursday, just to get you in for a follow-up. Stress sleep, all that. You know." "No," I said. "I don't know." He paused then, portfolio half open, and gave me the look people use when they want to keep irritation from showing because it would look ugly on them. "Dad, I mentioned it yesterday. In the kitchen. I don't believe you did." He let out a breath through his nose. Not a sigh exactly. More a controlled acknowledgement that some things were harder than they should be. "Okay. Maybe I thought I did. Either way, it's on the calendar now." He said that last sentence with a softness that made me dislike it at once. "I don't need a cognition check," I said. "It's not a test." He moved past me toward the kitchen, talking over his shoulder. "It's just Dr. Park making sure you're sleeping and eating and not getting overloaded, which frankly..." He stopped at the kitchen threshold and looked back. "Have you had breakfast?" "I had toast." "Actual toast? Or did you set bread on a plate and call it toast?" That was the sort of thing Daniel had begun saying in the last year of Eleanor's illness. Not often enough to quarrel over, just often enough to make a man aware that his son had started speaking to him as if the room contained an invisible third party who might need clarification. "I know what toast is," I said. He smiled as though I had almost made a joke and went into the kitchen. I followed more slowly. He stood in front of the pantry calendar, now scanning the squares with the brisk competence of a man at a job site. "Mara texted," he said. "She'll be here around 1. Pastor Haynes is coming by at 10 to go over the order. Ruth Hanley said she'll help with cards after. I moved the photos from the den because the light in there is too low. I like them in the den. No one can circulate in there." He opened the refrigerator without asking and frowned at the casseroles stacked in foil pans on every shelf. "Lord, we could feed Dayton." Then he shut the door and pointed with 2 fingers to the calendar. "I put Monday there because if we wait longer, they'll push you out 2 weeks. You need to let people help, Dad." I looked at the green words again. I could feel his body behind me, not touching, just close enough to make the kitchen feel smaller. It crossed my mind that if I had written the note myself and forgotten, Daniel would be standing in exactly the same place saying exactly the same sentence. That thought shamed me so suddenly, I had to grip the counter with my hand. This is what grief does, I told myself. It makes a son sound guilty because he is organized, and a calendar entry looks sinister because you have not slept. "Fine," I said. "We'll talk about it after today." He studied my face a moment too long, then nodded. "After today." He moved away, and I found that I had been holding my breath. The next 2 hours passed as such mornings do when a house is being prepared for mourning in company. Pastor Haynes came and stood in the living room with his binder reviewing order and timing while Daniel made notes in the portfolio as if the minister were reporting to him. The florist delivered 2 sprays with white ribbon that had to be trimmed because one bow blocked Eleanor's college photograph. I found the silver trays for cookies in the dining room sideboard and discovered someone had already polished them. Daniel said he had done it the night before after I went to bed. He said it in the tone of a man delivering useful fact, yet the idea of him opening that sideboard after midnight and handling Eleanor's silver gave me an irrational wash of anger. By 11, the house had warmed under the burden of bodies and ovens and flowers. The kitchen windows fogged lightly above the sink. The air smelled of coffee, baked ham glaze from the caterer's pans, wet wool from people's coats, on the hall tree, and the sweet rotting-edge lilies get when they have opened too quickly in central heating. I shaved upstairs and nicked myself under the jaw because the razor slipped when I thought I heard Eleanor cough in the bedroom. That did not happen, of course. I do not mean I heard a ghost. I mean the house held so many repetitions of her in it that the nerves made their own weather. When I came down dressed, Daniel was in the den. He had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the forearms, as though he were moving into serious work. One drawer of Eleanor's desk stood open. He was looking down into it with the portfolio balanced on the edge of the chair. "What are you doing?" I said. He glanced up. Finding the extra guest book pens, the one on the hall table died. I crossed the room faster than dignity required and saw at once that the guest book pens were exactly where they always had been, in the ceramic cup on the bookshelf by the French doors. "You didn't have to open that drawer," I said. His expression shifted so slightly another man might not have seen it. A tightening around the mouth, a tiny impatience with being corrected in a place he had decided was practical territory. I know that now. The drawer was not merely open. The contents had been moved. The pen cloth was unfolded. The envelopes in the back compartment were not square. The stamp dish had been set into the left corner instead of the center, and Eleanor's fountain pen lay across the top of the card stacks as if it were any ordinary tool. I reached past him and picked it up. "Dad," he said quietly, "you need to stop acting like every object in here is made of bone china." I turned then. "This one is not every object." He held my gaze half a second, then gave a little apologetic tilt of his head that in another man might have signaled retreat. In Daniel it signaled patience with deficiency. "All right," he said, "then put it somewhere safe." Somewhere safe. In my own house. In my dead wife's desk. "I already had," I said. He looked at me as though deciding whether the sentence was worth answering. Then he stepped aside and reached for his jacket. "People will be here soon." That might have been the end of it if not for the way he brushed his hand over the desk as he turned, flattening a stack of cards, centering the lamp, smoothing what was already smooth. I have known since he was 10 that Daniel cannot leave disorder alone, but there is a difference between neatness and correction. Standing there in the den with the lilies sweetening in the heat and the pen warm from another person's hand, I had my first strong thought that what unsettled me was not grief alone. It was being edited. Then the first guests arrived, and mourning in company leaves no room for private conclusions. The memorial itself was set for one in the living room because Eleanor had always said if people were going to speak honestly about a person, they ought to do it in a room where that person had actually lived. Pastor Haynes stood near the fireplace. The framed photographs were arranged from young girlhood through our wedding. The children, the beach trip to Hilton Head, where the wind got hold of the picnic umbrella. And Daniel broke 2 fingers trying to prove he could save it. Eleanor, in the garden. Eleanor, in the kitchen at Thanksgiving with flour on her cheek. Eleanor, in the blue coat. Mara had begged her to throw out for 10 years and never got her way. People came in carrying flowers and pie tins and their own grief rehearsed into politeness. Neighbors from 2 streets over. Old colleagues from the district. Ruth Hanley, in a navy cardigan with a silver cross pinned at the shoulder. The Millers from Church Mara, at last with wind in her hair and mascara already threatening because she had driven too fast. She hugged me on the porch hard enough to make my ribs hurt, and then held my face between both hands the way Eleanor used to do when she wanted to see whether I was telling the truth about being fine. "You slept?" she asked. "Not much." "That's not sleep. It's what I had." Daniel appeared behind her, took her garment bag, kissed her temple, and said, "I've got Dad on food and water. Don't worry." I did not like the phrase and disliked more that Mara seemed relieved by it. The service blurred in the way such things do. Pastor Haynes spoke warmly. Ruth read from Corinthians without performance. Mara said a few words about Eleanor's ability to make even bad news feel like information instead of judgment. I was asked to speak and did, though I remember almost none of it, except the moment my eyes fell on the kitchen doorway, and I thought of the morning 28 years ago when Eleanor stood there in her robe, holding a positive pregnancy test with both hands, as if it was something breakable, and said, "Tom, I think we've just lost quiet forever." Daniel spoke last. He did it well. Too well, perhaps, but one notices unfair things in grief. He talked about Eleanor's steadiness, her kindness, the way she held all of us together, especially when Dad was teaching nights, or buried in school papers, or just being Dad in that old-world, absent-minded way we all know and love. People smiled at that. I saw 3 heads turn toward me with sympathy so soft it stung. Daniel smiled too, not at me exactly, but in the direction of a shared family anecdote that suddenly belonged more to him than to the family itself. After the service, people drifted toward the dining room and kitchen where the food had been set out. The dining room table had been pushed to one wall to make room for standing plates and coffee cups. Eleanor's good white serving bowls were out, along with the silver-framed recipe card she always placed near the ham glaze at Easter, though she never let anyone take the recipe without phoning later to ask what kind of mustard they had used. There was the smell of coffee, scalloped potatoes, warm rolls, wet umbrellas by the door, perfume old wood, and underneath it all, the smell of dog from Henry the yellow lab next door, who had slipped through Gerald Pike's side gate and was nosing hopefully around the mudroom before someone shooed him back outside. That detail will matter only because at the time it felt so ordinary I trusted it. I had not wanted to eat, but enough people had touched my elbow and told me I needed something that I let Daniel steer me toward the sideboard where a row of small plates waited. He stood at my shoulder, one hand light between my shoulder blades, guiding without pushing. That was how it would have looked to anyone watching. Helpful son, fragile father, a tableau ready-made for sympathy. "You haven't had nearly enough today," he murmured. "I'm not hungry. That's not the same thing." He lifted a spoon from one of the small stoneware crocks near the end of the sideboard. I assumed it was pâté or some sort of savory spread someone had brought. The room was full of voices. Ruth was speaking to Mara by the coffee urn. Pastor Haynes was laughing softly at something Gerald had said. My head ached from being looked at. Daniel held the spoon up near my mouth with the absent authority of a nurse or a mother. "Just this," he said. I took it because refusing would have been childish, and because the whole house had become one long act of accepting what was put in my hands. The smell hit first. Metallic, gelatinous, faintly sweet in the wrong way. Then texture-soft chunks collapsing against my tongue with the unmistakable cheap gravy slickness of canned pet food. I spat it into my napkin on reflex before sense caught up. The taste was salt and liver and shame. My stomach turned so violently I had to grab the edge of the sideboard. Daniel leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "This is what parasites eat," he said, smiling as though we were sharing some bitter family joke. For 1 second the room went soundless around me. Not silent, in fact, there were still voices, silverware, the coffee maker clicking, but soundless in the way a man's head can become when humiliation arrives too cleanly to be understood at once. I looked at him. His face had not changed. That was the worst of it. Not rage, not drunken malice. Only a bright, composed expression with sorrow waiting behind it like a second actor in the wings. Then he pivoted. "Oh, Dad," he said in a voice just loud enough for the women nearest the table to hear. No, don't hear, spit it out." "It's all right." He took the napkin from my hand, as though rescuing me from some confusion of my own making. A few heads turned. Mara stepped forward. Daniel touched my arm and said with tender embarrassment, "He's had almost nothing today. I knew this might happen." "What happened?" Mara said. "He thought that was the pâté," Daniel said. I stared at him. There was, in fact, an open can of dog food on the lower shelf of the sideboard near the mudroom door where someone must have set it after Henry's little invasion. Perhaps Gerald. Perhaps one of the neighborhood boys sent to carry in chairs. I do not know. All I know is that Daniel's eyes flicked toward it for a fraction of a second and then back to my face with the patient-stricken love of a son tending a father who cannot be trusted with ordinary distinctions. Mara took my elbow. "Dad." "It wasn't an accident," I said, though the words felt thick and foolish in my mouth. "He gave it to me." Daniel's expression altered again, this time to wounded caution. "Dad." "You heard me." Several people were looking now. Pastor Haynes had stopped mid-sentence. Ruth Hanley's hand was still on the coffee pot. The room tilted in that subtle, dreadful way public rooms tilt when a family line has been crossed, and everyone present hopes it is temporary madness because the alternative is uglier. Daniel lowered his voice. "I think you need to sit down." That was the moment I knew with sick certainty that whatever had just happened was larger than cruelty. Cruelty can be private, impulsive, hot. This was shaped. The spoon, the room, the witnesses, the immediate, soft concern. He had not merely wanted to insult me. He had wanted to place me in a story. "I'm not sitting down," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The taste was still in my mouth, animal and tinny. I put my hand on the sideboard to keep from doing something foolish. Mara looked from me to Daniel and back again. She was trying to understand, and understanding was exactly what Daniel meant to outrun. "Dad skipped breakfast," he said to her quietly. "Not quiet enough. He's exhausted." I had breakfast. Toast isn't breakfast. There was a little murmur from somebody near the doorway, the sort of sympathetic nonsense people make when they do not know where to set their eyes. Daniel took a clean glass from the tray, filled it with water from the pitcher, and held it out to me in front of everyone. "Here." I did not take it. He set it down anyway, his movements controlled and competent. Then he turned to the room with a small apologetic smile that I will hate until the day I die. "I'm sorry, everybody. He's had a rough week." He said it in the tone of a man who has borne worse with grace. I left the room then because staying would have required a spectacle, and Eleanor hated spectacle. Even furious, ashamed, and tasting dog food, I could not bear to give her memorial over to shouting. I went into the downstairs powder room off the hall and locked the door behind me. Then I leaned over the sink and ran cold water into my mouth until my teeth hurt. The powder room had blue wallpaper with tiny white vines Eleanor had chosen in 1998 because, as she said, every house deserved one room that knew how to behave. There was a dish of wrapped guest soaps on the back of the toilet and a framed pencil drawing Mara had made in 10th grade of the front porch in winter. I looked at that drawing while the faucet ran, and for reasons I cannot entirely justify, that was what undid me. Not the insult itself. Not Daniel's face. The porch in winter rendered by our daughter's teenage hand because it belonged to a time when the four of us still occupied the same story. I braced both hands on the sink. Eleanor had stood in that doorway during the last week she was able to walk downstairs on her own. One hand on the frame, the other pressed flat against her ribs where the disease had made everything tender. I had been kneeling by the hall closet trying to find the extra napkins for soup night at church. She looked so thin in that moment that anger came to me before sorrow. I said, "For God's sake, why didn't you call me?" And she smiled in the patient, tired way she had when she knew I was frightened under whatever voice I had chosen. Then she said, "Tom, don't bark at me for needing a wall." After that she came in, sat on the closed toilet lid. And while I pretended to sort napkins, she told me Daniel had called 3 times that morning already to make sure she had eaten. "He means well," I said. She looked at me a moment too long and answered, "Sometimes that is the most exhausting thing a person can mean." I had not thought about that in months. Standing there in the powder room with my mouth tasting of metal and gravy, I heard it again, and the memory changed shape. At the time, I had heard only a sick woman tired of fussing. Now, for the first time, I wondered what else she had been too tired to name. The knock at the door came softly. Tom Ruth Hanley. I shut off the water. Yes. May I come in? After a second, I unlocked the door. Ruth stepped inside and closed it behind her, not fully, just enough to make the hall recede. She had removed her cardigan sometime during the meal and carried it over one arm. Without the cardigan, she looked smaller, sharper, her wrists bird-boned and competent. She smelled faintly of Shalimar and church coffee. "You all right?" she asked. "No." She nodded as though that were the correct answer to a plain question. Then she held out a folded linen handkerchief. I took it, though I did not need it. "Daniel said you mistook the dog food for pâté," she said. "That's not what happened." "I know." Those 2 words steadied me more than any comfort could have. We stood a moment in the little room with the bad blue wallpaper and the guest soaps and the muffled sound of people lowering their voices outside because lowered voices feel useful to the helpless. Ruth said, "You don't have to perform for me." I sat then, not on the toilet lid, but on the small chair Eleanor had once insisted on putting in the corner because older guests deserved somewhere to set a handbag if they did not trust floors. It creaked under me. "Did you see it?" I asked. "I saw." "Enough." "What does that mean?" "It means I saw his face before he changed it." I looked up at her. Ruth's expression had gone very still. "Tom, I am not going to say more in a powder room with half the church in your hall, but I am going to tell you this much. Go wash your face, come back out. Get through today. Then let me help you with the cards after everyone's gone." Something in her tone made my skin rise along my arms despite the warm room. "What are you saying?" "Not yet." She stepped back and opened the door a little wider. "Later." I should have pressed her. I know that now. But grief and humiliation reduce a man's ambition. At that moment, later seemed plenty. When I came out, Daniel was in the front hall, speaking to Gerald Pike about parking overflow on the curb, all concern and logistics and only endurance. He turned when he saw me and gave me a look one might give an invalid who had managed a difficult staircase. I walked past him without stopping. Mara watched us both from the living room doorway, her face tense with that old sibling arithmetic in which one child measures the other against the parent and cannot yet decide where reality lies. I hated that he had brought her to that edge. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of departure. Coats gathered. Tin foil was folded over leftovers. Flowers were redistributed to people who insisted they would hate to see them go to waste. Pastor Haynes squeezed my shoulder with both hands and said Eleanor's kindness would outlast us all, which was true enough and still not a comfort. By 4:30, the house had thinned to family Ruth Hanley and Gerald, next door carrying back the folding chairs he had loaned from his garage. Daniel moved through the rooms restoring order with almost manic efficiency. Cups into trash bags, serving spoons into the sink photographs, back into the cardboard flats from the basement. Twice I found him in the den, though there was no reason to be there. Once he said he was looking for tape. Once he said he needed an envelope for the pastor's honorarium, though there were envelopes in the kitchen drawer by the phone. Each time he left the room, a little altered behind him, not enough for accusation, too much for comfort. By 6, Mara had gone upstairs to change out of her black dress because she was staying the night after all, and Gerald had departed with a hand on my shoulder and a quiet, "Holler if you need anything, Tom." Daniel said he had one last run to make to the funeral home to return a stand and would be back in 20 minutes. I nearly told him not to come back at all, but the sentence seemed too large for the state of the day. So I let him go. The front door shut. His car backed down the drive. The house fell into that peculiar post-company silence in which the air itself seems tired. Ruth remained in the dining room gathering the sympathy cards into piles. I was in the kitchen rinsing coffee cups when she said, "Would you bring the writing tray in here?" "Tom." I dried my hands and carried the tray from the den. She had cleared a space at the dining room table beneath the chandelier. The late light had gone amber through the west windows, striking dust in the air and the silver on the sideboard with that tired, rich glow old houses wear toward evening. The table smelled faintly of beeswax polish and ham glaze. Ruth began sorting cards with practiced hands, reading names once and setting each aside according to some system she did not need to explain. I watched her a moment, then said, "What did you mean in there?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted the top card from the stack, turned it over, and looked toward the den. Was he in her desk again today? Yes. I thought so. How? Because these are wrong. She separated the top 3 cards from the pile, laid them on the table, then aligned them with the side of her hand. Her thumb smoothed the edges once, twice. It was such a precise little motion that I felt absurdly as if I were watching another language. Eleanor always stacked family cards on the left, she said. Church notes on the right. Envelopes face down under each pile, stamps in the dish not laid out like samples. She did it that way because she said grief made people clumsy and a good system ought to save them from showing it. I said nothing. Ruth lifted one envelope and held it where the light struck the flap. And she never made this mark for an address check. She made a lower stroke. Lazy, almost horizontal. This one is trying too hard. A chill began in the back of my neck and moved downward. She showed you that, I asked. Ruth looked at me, then properly looked with pity, held back hard enough to keep its dignity. Tom, I sat at that desk with your wife every month for 10 years after choir practice, addressing sympathy cards and meal schedules. I know how she stacked paper. The dining room seemed suddenly farther from the kitchen than it had ever been. The old grandfather clock in the hall began to strike 6:30, each note heavy and separate. I told myself I said that grief was making me foolish. Grief does make fools of people, Ruth said. That doesn't mean it invents every wrong thing it sees. She gathered the cards again, slower this time. Her hands were not shaking. Mine were. What are you trying to tell me? She took a breath and lowered her voice, though there was no one near enough now to overhear. I'm trying to tell you I watched Daniel during Eleanor's illness ask more than once how she worded things. Updates to the church, notes to the neighborhood women, messages for the meal train. He said he wanted to make sure he sounded like Mom. I thought at the time it was grief and overhelping, and that perhaps I was being uncharitable for finding it strange. The clock finished striking. In the quiet after the refrigerator in the kitchen kicked on with a low electrical hum. Somewhere upstairs, Mara shut a drawer. The whole house seemed to lean in around us. Ruth set the cards down. She never stacked them like that, she said. Ruth's words sat between us on the dining room table like an object neither of us had meant to set down. I looked at the stack of condolence cards in her hands and then toward the den where the lamp still burned over Eleanor's desk. From where I stood, I could see only the edge of the writing chair and the corner of the desk blotter, but that was enough. Enough to make the room feel occupied by a problem that had not been there that morning, or had been there and only now admitted itself. You think he's been going through her desk, I said. Ruth did not rush to answer. She laid the envelopes down in 2 clean rows and adjusted one by a 1/4 inch until it matched the other. I think he has been behaving like a man who believes the house is a system he can run better than the people who built it. That is not the same thing. No, she said. It's worse. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Upstairs, a floorboard gave under Mara's step and then again a little softer, as if she had sat on the bed in the guest room and let her weight settle. Outside, a car rolled slowly past the house on wet pavement tires, whispering over the street. Ordinary sounds, neighborhood sounds, the kind of sounds a man ought to hear and trust. Yet the whole place had shifted by 1/2 degree. It felt to me as if the house had turned its face and was waiting to see what I would do. Ruth gathered the cards again and slid them into the writing tray. You do not have to decide everything tonight, Tom. I kept my eyes on the tray. You're asking me not to call my own son a liar until I'm calmer. I am asking you not to confront a practiced man without more than a hunch. Practiced. The word settled badly. He fed me dog food at his mother's memorial, and then he explained it for the room before you had drawn breath. Yes. She folded her cardigan over the back of a chair and reached for her purse. Which is why you mustn't go into this angry and under-evidenced. I laughed once, a short, dry sound that surprised me. Under-evidenced. You sound like Mara. She got that from somebody useful, I hope. Ruth fastened her purse and looked at me with the blunt compassion of a woman who has outlived the need to pretend that hard things are softened by silence. The first week after a death is when families decide what story they are going to tell themselves. Some of them choose truth. Some of them choose convenience. I am advising you not to let convenience harden before you know what you are standing in. I wanted to ask her how long she had suspected Daniel of this particular ugliness, whether she had seen anything beyond the desk and the asking after Eleanor's phrasing, whether my wife had ever said his name in the same tired tone she had used in that powder room memory. But some pride in me, or some remnant of order, made me ask. Only did Eleanor know, Ruth's face changed then. Not much. Just enough around the eyes for me to feel the answer before she gave it. I don't know what she knew, she said. I know she managed more than most people saw. That hurt in a way I had not expected. It was not an accusation, not quite, but it opened a space in the room where accusation could live if it needed to. Managed more than most people saw. I heard in that not just Daniel, but me. Me who had lived in the same house with Eleanor for 44 years and still found myself looking to Ruth Hanley to tell me which way my wife stacked paper. Ruth picked up the tray and carried it into the den. I followed automatically. She set the cards back on the desk, this time in Eleanor's order, the top pile squared to the edge. Then she took the fountain pen where it lay across the blotter and held it toward me. "Put this somewhere else tonight," she said. "It belongs here." It belonged here when her hand was the last one to touch it. I stared at the pen. In the lamplight, the black barrel shone blue at the edges. The repaired nib, the tiny crescent of gold where it caught the light, looked delicate as a thumbnail. This morning it had been memory. By evening it was something else. Not evidence exactly. I was not yet ready to speak that word aloud even to myself. But not memory alone. I took it from her and felt absurdly protective. In the top bedroom drawer, Ruth said, "Not because he can't find it if he wants to, because you need to know tomorrow where you left it." I almost told her that I already knew such things, that I was not a child marking his own trail in breadcrumbs. But the truth was I no longer trusted the sentence once it formed in my mind. I had been sure about breakfast that morning, sure about the calendar, sure about the desk. And at every turn Daniel had stepped forward with that infuriating softness and made certainty sound like strain. "All right," I said. She nodded. "Good." When she left, half an hour later, the house seemed to exhale around her departure and then grow more vigilant. Mara came down in jeans and one of Eleanor's old Fair Isle sweaters she had found in the cedar chest without asking. On anyone else that might have annoyed me. On Mara, it made my throat tighten. The sweater had belonged to a trip we took to Vermont in 1999, when Daniel was already tall enough to insist he did not need gloves and spent 2 days pretending his hands were fine, until Eleanor stuffed chemical warmers into his coat pockets and he nearly cried from gratitude disguised as embarrassment. Mara had been 8, then all front teeth and velocity, and Eleanor had laughed so hard over the breakfast table waffles one morning that syrup came out her nose. It had become family legend. One of those stories repeated not because it was extraordinary, but because it proved we had once been a house full of ridiculous warmth. Now, Mara stood at the sink in that same sweater sleeves pushed to the elbows, rinsing the last coffee cups with an efficiency that tried to pass for calm. "Ruth stayed a while," she said. She did. She looked upset. She was. Mara set a cup in the rack. "Dad." I turned from the kitchen counter where I had been pretending to sort foil lids. "What? What happened with Daniel today?" There are times when a father answers that question directly because it is the only honest thing left to do. This should have been one of them. Instead, I heard myself say, "He had no right." Mara dried her hands and faced me. "That's not an answer." I looked beyond her out the sink window into the dark side yard where the porch light had thrown a pale fan over the wet paving stones. The hosta beds were black humps in the dirt. Somewhere across the fence a dog barked once and stopped. "He did it on purpose," I said. "Fed you that on purpose?" "Yes." She was silent a moment. "He says he was trying to get you to eat something before your blood sugar dropped." I turned then. "Do not repeat that to me in my kitchen. I'm not siding with him. You just used his words." Her face hardened a little. "Not against me, exactly. Against being made messenger. I'm telling you what he said." "And what do you think?" Mara looked down at the dish towel in her hands. "I think Daniel's been unbearable since Mom got sick. I think he talks like a hospital administrator now. I think he can make cruelty sound organized. But I also think—" She broke off. "What?" She looked up again, and I saw in her the same blend of caution and pity I had seen on too many faces that day. "I think you're tired enough that he can get around you right now." The sentence landed gently and still stung. "I am not confused," I said. "I didn't say you were." "No, you just walked your way politely around it." She sighed and leaned one hip against the counter. "Dad, I drove 3 hours here after standing in court all morning and listening to you on the phone sounding like you hadn't slept in a week. Then I watched my brother act like a martyr and you act like you might break a plate over his head. I'm trying to figure out what is actually happening." That was fair enough that I could not fight it. Fairness has often been Mara's weapon, sharpened by years of growing up between Daniel's force and my own preference for quiet. "There was a note on the calendar," I said. "For Monday, with Dr. Park." "Okay, I didn't put it there. Daniel says he made the appointment." "That sounds like him. It said cognition check." Mara's fingers tightened on the dish towel. "What?" "He says it's not a test." Her face changed, but only for a second. Then the trained professional calm came down over it. She was a paralegal, not a lawyer, but I had watched enough from the edges of her work life to know when she began arranging facts into possible meanings. "Did he actually use those words?" "Yes." "And you don't remember agreeing to it?" "No." "Could you have—" The question was unbearable because it was reasonable. I looked at her long enough that she lowered her eyes first. "Go to bed, Mara." "Dad." "Go to bed." She opened her mouth, closed it, and finally nodded. "I'm not leaving in the morning." I did not answer. She touched my shoulder as she passed the way Eleanor used to do when she knew I was furious and would hate being touched if I had a second to prepare for it. Then she went upstairs. I locked the doors, checked the back mudroom twice, and stood for a while in the front hall with the fountain pen in my hand. The house had that late evening smell older houses get when company has passed through them and gone cooling coffee damp wool from coats that were no longer there, polished wood, stale ham glaze from the dining room, and the thick, sweet funeral lily scent gone almost sour in the warm air. I went into the bedroom at last and put Eleanor's pen in the top drawer of my side table exactly where Ruth had told me. I laid it on the folded handkerchiefs, closed the drawer, and stood with my hand on the knob. The room was tidy because I could not bear for it not to be. Her side of the bed was made smooth every morning, the pillow centered, though no one would have noticed if I had left it rumpled. Her robe no longer hung on the hook behind the door because Mara had quietly taken it to the cleaner with the other things after the visitation, but I still saw the outline of it when I glanced that way. On her dresser stood the framed photograph from our 30th anniversary, taken by a waiter at the restaurant in German Village, where she had insisted the lighting was too flattering to be trusted. In it, she looked straight into the camera with that mix of amusement and composure that made men more certain than they should have been that they were the cleverest person in the room when in fact it was always Eleanor simply letting them have a minute. I sat on the edge of the bed and remembered with a vividness that made my chest feel bruised one night in late October of her last year. She had been down to a half appetite and full exhaustion by then. Daniel was coming by nearly every day, bringing groceries, handling insurance calls, talking over me in practical bursts that I sometimes found annoying and sometimes, I admit with shame, relieving. That night, he had stayed after supper and taken over the den desk to answer condolence messages for a church widow whose husband had died unexpectedly. Eleanor had asked him to help because her hands hurt. I had gone upstairs early, embarrassed by my own uselessness in the face of all that paperwork. Around 10, she came into the bedroom, sat on the bed to take off her earrings, and said, "Daniel is very good at learning systems." I remember smiling and saying something stupid like, "He gets that from you." She looked at me in the mirror. That isn't always the compliment men think it is. Then she changed into a nightgown and asked whether I had set the thermostat back. That was all. At the time I heard in it only a tired woman's irritation with an over-helpful son. Sitting on the bed the night after her memorial, I heard something else pressing behind it. Not a warning exactly. More an old pressure I had once mistaken for weather. I slept badly and in pieces. Twice I woke thinking I heard the desk drawer in the den slide open. Once I went halfway down the hall before I realized the sound had only been the furnace coming alive beneath the floor grates. At some point near dawn, I dreamed Eleanor was at her desk, writing with the fountain pen, and every envelope she addressed turned blank the moment she set it aside. I woke with my heart beating as if I had been chased. The house in early morning was gray and cold. I went downstairs in my robe and turned on the kitchen light. The bulb over the sink had gone weak again, giving off that low yellow fatigue it always did right before, burning out, and in its light, the kitchen looked not haunted, which is nonsense, but unwell. The message pad by the wall phone sat crooked on the counter. The little magnetic pencil Eleanor kept clipped to it lay on the floor under the radiator, as if dropped or nudged. On the kitchen table beside the sugar bowl was a white envelope addressed to me in a hand I did not at first recognize because I was still half asleep. It was from Dr. Park's office. I stood there a long moment before opening it. The paper inside was not formal letterhead, just the standard appointment reminder card clipped to a printed after-hours note. The reminder read, "Thomas Weller, Monday, 10:30 a.m. Follow-up with cognitive screening discussion." The note typed beneath said, "Please arrive 15 minutes early. Family member encouraged to attend." The word encouraged sat on the page with an intimacy that made me flush. Family member, not daughter or son, not spouse, obviously not patient preference. A role already waiting in the room. I set the card on the table and went to the pantry calendar. The green entry was still there. Below it, in different ink blue, this time someone had added, "Bring medication list." I did not remember seeing that the day before. There are moments when a man knows, if not what is happening, that the number of accidents available to explain it has begun to shrink. This was one of them. I held the pantry door with one hand and tried to reconstruct the previous day's square as precisely as if I were standing in court myself. Green ink, yes. Monday, yes. Dr. Park, cognition check, yes. Blue addition beneath. I did not think so. But grief had already taught me to distrust anything in the mind that arrived with confidence. Confidence had become suspect by association. The front door latch clicked. I turned so fast the pantry door swung back against its frame. Gerald Pike stepped into the hall carrying a folded newspaper and wearing his old postal service cap despite the damp. "Morning, Tom," he called, then saw my face and stopped. I didn't mean to barrel in. Door was open. It wasn't. He looked back at it. Well, it is now. I crossed the hall and saw at once that the deadbolt was thrown back. I had locked it the night before. I knew I had locked it. I always tested the knob after. Habit. Still, I heard myself say, "Maybe Mara came down. Her car's still out back," Gerald said. "I just came by to bring your paper. Ours got dropped on your porch again." He held up the folded dispatch, but I was looking at the brass deadbolt above his wrist. It showed a fresh crescent scratch below the plate as if someone had missed the slot in a hurry or in low light. Gerald glanced from the lock to me. "You all right?" "No," I said. He stepped inside fully then, and shut the door behind him with a quiet care that was almost priestly. Gerald had been our neighbor 28 years. Retired postmaster widower, a man who moved slowly until suddenly he didn't. He drank bad coffee with me on Saturday mornings in summer, and had once, in 2011, climbed onto my garage roof in dress shoes to help me recover a tarp in a thunderstorm because the hardware store is closed and Pride is open all night. He was not imaginative. One of the things I trusted about him was how little romance he brought to any situation. "I saw Daniel at your mailbox yesterday morning," he said, as though picking up a conversation we had been having all along. "Didn't think much of it till later." My eyes went to him. "What time?" "Oh, early. 7:30 maybe." I was getting my own paper and saw him come up the drive with a stack of envelopes in one hand. Thought he was helping you with thank you notes. He opened the mailbox, took something out, stood there a second reading it, then went back in through the side door. He said it mildly. Mildness from Gerald was often where significance began. He took something out, so it looked to me. "Did he put anything in?" Gerald thought. "No, don't believe so." Just stood there with his head bent over what he'd pulled out. A small pulse began in my temple. He never told me that. Well, why would he? Gerald set the newspaper on the hall table. Folks doing favors don't always issue bulletins. It was such an ordinary sentence that under different circumstances I might have agreed. Instead, I heard in it the whole American religion of gratitude that had protected Daniel for months, if not longer. Folks doing favors, you were expected to accept the hand reaching into your life if it called itself helpful enough. "Did he see you?" I asked. Gerald tugged the brim of his cap. "Maybe. I was across the hedge." He nodded once, sort of. Then he went in. I thanked him, or tried to. The words came out wrong. He looked toward the kitchen and lowered his voice. "You want me to say something if I notice anything else, something else?" I nearly laughed. "I don't know what there is to notice yet." Gerald studied me a moment with the grave caution men our age bring to each other when illness or humiliation enters the yard. "Then, let's say I'll notice anyway." After he left, I stood at the kitchen table with Dr. Park's reminder card and the newspaper unopened beneath my hand. The house had begun producing facts faster than I could fit them into any decent shape. Mailbox, calendar, desk, pen, door unlocked. Each thing by itself still small enough to be ridiculous in a story told aloud. Together, they had started to acquire edges. Mara came down at 8, with her hair tied back and Eleanor's sweater buttoned wrong in the hurry of dressing. I noticed and nearly told her, then didn't. She took one look at my face and said, "What happened now?" "That depends," I said, "on whether you'd like coffee before the world ends." She stared at me another second, then said, "Coffee first." We sat at the kitchen table with a reminder card between us. I told her about Gerald and the mailbox, about the deadbolt, about the blue ink addition to the calendar note. She listened without interrupting, one hand wrapped around her mug, the other flattened on the table near the card, as if keeping it from drifting away. When I finished, she said, "Let me see the calendar." We went to the pantry door. She stood so close beside me I could smell the lavender shampoo she had used since college. She bent her head reading. "The blue line definitely isn't Mom's," she said. "The green, maybe." "No." "Wait." She leaned closer. "No, the pressure's wrong." I turned to her. "You see it too?" "I see a difference," she said quickly. "That's not the same as knowing who wrote it. Daniel knew about the appointment before I did. He could have made it. I know he made it. That isn't the issue, Dad. The issue is whether he made it because he's controlling or because he genuinely thinks you need." I stepped away from the pantry. "Do not finish that sentence. Because he thinks you need support," she said. Anyway, though she softened the last word, the kitchen went still around us. The clock over the mudroom door ticked. Coffee steamed. Somewhere upstairs, a heat vent clicked. "You're doing it too," I said. "Doing what?" "Leaving the door open just wide enough to call it concern if anyone asks later." Her eyes flashed. "That is unfair." "Is it?" "Yes." She set her mug down too hard. "You know what, Dad? I'm trying very hard to be careful because I have seen families blow themselves apart around an older parent's pride, and I have seen the opposite too, where everyone tiptoes around a real problem until it costs them time they can't get back. So I am asking questions. That is not betrayal." The word caught both of us off guard. I saw it land in her face. "Who said betrayal?" she muttered. "I didn't. But you thought it." I looked at the calendar square again because looking at my daughter was suddenly harder. I thought a lot of things yesterday. Mara was quiet a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Less courtroom, more daughter. "Daniel called me in February." I turned. "He said he was worried about you," she said. "Not like this. Not—" She made a frustrated motion toward the pantry door. "He said you were mixing up bills, forgetting to return calls, getting turned around on appointments Mom used to manage. He said grief was going to hit you late, and when it did, we needed to be ready." The room seemed to tip toward her words. "What did you tell him, that he was catastrophizing?" She folded her arms. "He didn't like that. Did he ask you to take notes?" She looked away. The answer came before the words. "Mara. He said if I visited more, I should write down anything that seemed off. Not for a case," he said, "for a record, in case we had to help you later and you got stubborn." A kind of clean cold spread through me then, so thorough it was almost relief. Because for the first time, the thing I feared most, that I was reading malice into ordinary care, had to share space with another possibility, uglier and more coherent. Daniel had not begun after the memorial. He had been laying foundation. "And you did?" She looked back at me sharply. "No." "Jesus, Dad." "You hesitated." "Because I almost did one time." The words came out fast now, angry at herself. "In March. You missed the electric bill, and I thought maybe he was right that you were dropping things. I missed it because the online payment didn't go through, and the paper notice got stuck to one of your mother's oncology statements. I know that now. You knew that then if you had asked me." Her mouth tightened. "Maybe I didn't know how to ask you without sounding like him." That took some of the anger out of the room and replaced it with something sadder. Mara had always been less forceful than Daniel, but she was not weaker. She simply disliked entering a space once she sensed somebody else had already staked it out. It occurred to me then that whatever Daniel had been building around me, he had been building around her too. A structure of pre-explanations, ready-made interpretations, the subtle, humiliating generosity of a man willing to help everyone understand the difficult parent. She went to the sink and stood with both hands on the counter, looking out at the side yard. "I'm not saying I believe him," she said. "You believed him enough to keep the possibility." She did not answer. That more than the calendar or the mailbox cost me something. Because it meant Daniel's version of me had already entered the family bloodstream, not fully, not decisively, but enough to circulate. Enough that when I insisted on my own mind, I sounded to my daughter like a man defending pride against the weather. At 9:30, I called Dr. Park's office and said I would be there Monday. The receptionist, a young woman named Tasha, who had once sent Eleanor a handwritten sympathy card when our old dog died, sounded almost relieved. "Wonderful, Mr. Weller," she said. "We'll see you and your family member at 10:15. "My what?" There was a little pause. Papers rustled. "Your family member." "The note says a family member is encouraged to attend." That was not my request. "Of course," she said quickly. "Just a standard recommendation." I thanked her and hung up, feeling as though I had been politely escorted into a room whose dimensions had already been decided without me. The next 2 days passed not quickly, but densely. That is the best word I have. The house did not become dramatic. It became thick with little contradictions. The message pad by the kitchen phone appeared twice in the den, and once on the windowsill by the side door, each time with a page folded back, as though someone had been taking down calls at odd stations around the house. I found a note in blue ink tucked beneath the sugar bowl, "Meds refill Tuesday," which might have been practical, except I have never called pills meds in my life, and neither did Eleanor. On Wednesday morning, the magnetic pencil was clipped to the top of the pad instead of the side, a trivial detail that nonetheless struck me as wrong with physical force. Eleanor clipped it sideways because she said up and down pencils caught sleeves. Each time I noticed one of these shifts, I felt the same sequence within myself, first the jolt of recognition, then the reflexive shame at noticing, then the miserable act of deciding whether to correct it or leave it be. I corrected some, left others. Began, though, I told no one, writing small notes to myself on the backs of junk envelopes and sliding them into my shirt pocket. Tuesday, 7:10 a.m. Message pad at side door. Wednesday, 6:40 a.m. Sugar bowl note appeared. It was a furtive, childish practice, and I hated it, which may be why I trusted it. A man does not like feeling like a spy in his own kitchen unless something has already gone wrong. Daniel came by on Tuesday evening with groceries I had not asked for and a new bulb for the sink light. "I was at Lowe's," he said when I told him I hadn't needed one. It took 5 minutes. He moved around the kitchen, replacing the bulb with the quiet competence of a man doing his father a favor, and because the kitchen was small, I had to stand half aside and watch him work. He wore jeans and a navy quarter zip, and spoke in a near whisper because Mara, who had stayed an extra day, was upstairs taking a work call. I had not told him she was still there. The knowledge bothered me. "You should let me come with you Monday," he said, twisting the glass globe back over the new bulb. "I should not." He lowered his arms and looked at me. "Dad, this doesn't have to be a referendum on anything. It became one when you made the appointment. I made an appointment because you've been off, tired, distracted, forgetful. Give me an example." He reached for the grocery sack and took out a carton of eggs. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You hear concern and turn it into cross-examination. No, I hear accusation wrapped for church." He smiled, then very slightly. Not because anything was funny, because I had confirmed something for him. "You know," he said, "setting the eggs in the refrigerator, Mom used to say the minute you felt cornered, you started grading people's wording instead of answering the point." My chest went tight. "Did she?" "She was tired, Dad. She saw more than you think." He said it casually, still bent to the refrigerator shelf as if reporting where the mustard ought to go. That was his talent. To place emotional explosives inside ordinary domestic movements so that by the time you registered the blast, he had already closed the door and moved on. He stayed 20 minutes, fixed the bulb, rearranged the leftovers, asked if I had my medication list ready for Monday. When he left, the kitchen looked cleaner and felt violated. Afterward, I went upstairs to the bedroom and opened the drawer where I had hidden Eleanor's fountain pen. I do not know exactly why. To reassure myself, perhaps. To confirm that some line still held. The pen lay where I had put it diagonally across the folded handkerchiefs. I picked it up and unscrewed the barrel. The ink cartridge inside was not the one I had loaded for Eleanor in February. It was the same brand, same blue-black color, but new. Too full. The one I had put in just before she got too weak to write more than 2 notes at a sitting had been half used by the time she died. I remember that because I had thought absurdly that I would leave it as it was, forever the last ink she had pressed into paper still held inside the pen. Instead, I held a full cartridge in my hand and understood with a nausea more intimate than what had happened at the memorial that someone had changed it. I sat on the edge of the bed with the pen open in my lap and had to close my eyes. The first image that came was not of Daniel. It was of Eleanor at the desk in late summer. The window cracked cicadas drilling outside her left hand, resting over the shopping list while she wrote a check for the church roof fund with the fountain pen because she said donations should never look dashed off. She had looked up at me then and said, "If you ever start using this pen after I'm dead, Tom, please don't murder the nib." It's had a long enough life. I had laughed, told her that if she was dead, I would have more serious duties than stationery etiquette. And she had answered, "You would be surprised what keeps a person from coming apart." Sitting on the bed now, pen open, fresh cartridge glistening, I heard the sentence differently. Not as charm, as instruction. I went downstairs with the pen and stood in the den for a long time without turning on the lamp. The room was blue with evening, the windows reflecting back the furniture in soft dark shapes, the bookshelves, the chair with the worn arm where Eleanor used to read, the desk as a rectangle of deeper shadow. I did not want to switch on the lamp because the light made the room feel claimable, and for that moment I was not sure by whom. On Thursday morning, Mara left for Columbus with promises to call before my appointment Monday, and a look in her eyes that told me she was trying to decide whether leaving me alone was irresponsible or respectful. At the door, she hugged me hard and said, "Do not let Daniel railroad you in that office. I didn't know he needed tracks laid." She gave half a laugh. "Call me after." When she drove away, the house felt at once larger and less defended. I spent the rest of Thursday in a kind of strained attentiveness. The weather had turned. Wind rattled the loose branch against the gutter over the side porch, and the smell through the kitchen screens was wet soil and cold metal. I walked room to room, not like a man searching for anything dramatic, but like one taking inventory after a storm that might have entered under the doors. In the den, the desk had shifted again. Not much. The blotter angled a little off square. The tray of outgoing mail moved 2 inches left. The little ceramic cup for guest book pens missing from the bookshelf and returned to the rear corner of the desk drawer. The drawer itself, when I opened it, showed the envelopes reorganized by size instead of by purpose. That last detail struck me so sharply, I put my hand flat on the desk to steady myself. Eleanor had always said sizing paper was a store's concern. A house ought to sort by use. Thank you notes, invitations, bills, personal letters. Purpose first. Daniel, on the other hand, sorted everything by type. I had seen his garage, shelves labeled extension cords, paint supplies, yard chemicals, not by season or frequency, but by category, like a warehouse. I closed the drawer without correcting it. That decision felt like a moral surrender. The whole impulse of my body wanted to set it right. But some stubborn new thing in me, anger perhaps, or survival, held my hand still. If I moved it back, the room would tell me nothing tomorrow. That afternoon, Ruth Hanley called. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. "I was at the church office and found 2 of Eleanor's old family update drafts in the supply folder Daniel borrowed from us in January. Do you want them?" My grip tightened on the receiver. Why would they be there? That is what I thought. "Yes," I said. "Bring them." She came an hour later with the drafts in a manila interoffice envelope. We stood in the den by the desk while rain streaked the windows. The house smelled of damp leaves and radiator heat. Ruth laid the pages out side by side under the lamp. The first was Eleanor's hand all through short factual update on treatment gratitude for meals, a brief joke about hospital coffee. The second was a typed version sent later that same week to a broader church list. And though the words were mostly hers, there were additions in a tone so faintly different you might not have noticed unless you had known her marrow deep. "Thank you for understanding that Tom is overwhelmed with practical matters. Daniel has graciously been helping coordinate many of the details." Eleanor would never have written graciously about her own son. She would have written kindly, yes, proudly, yes, but never in the inflated language of committee reports. More than that, there was a sentence at the end I could not stop reading. "Please be patient if responses from the house are delayed. Tom is not always tracking messages well these days." I felt my face go hot and then cold. She wrote that I said. Ruth shook her head once. "No. How do you know?" "Because I removed it before the final mailing and rewrote the line myself." She met my eyes. I thought at the time Daniel had suggested it, and she was too tired to argue. She asked me to make it kinder. The room seemed to contract around the desk. Did she say that? She said, He isn't wrong about the delay, but I will not have Tom made into a problem people pity before he has earned it. I sat down heavily in Eleanor's chair. Rain ticked against the window. Somewhere the wind worried the branch over the gutter again. Ruth's face across the desk had the solemn steadiness of a woman laying out medicine. "That was January," I said. "Yes." "She was still alive?" "Yes." I looked at the typed page again. "Please be patient if responses from the house are delayed. Tom is not always tracking messages well these days." A memory came then with such force I said no aloud before I meant to. Ruth waited. In February, one evening after chemotherapy, Eleanor had asked me whether I had called her cousin in Dayton back about the prayer quilt the churchwomen were mailing. I said I had not received any message. Daniel, who was loading the dishwasher, said from across the kitchen I took it. "You were napping." I remember being annoyed only because he said it like a correction. Eleanor had looked from him to me and then said too lightly, "Well, then let's not make a federal case of Cousin Nancy." We all laughed, or thought we did. Now under the den lamp with the rain and Ruth and the typed page, I saw it differently. Not one moment. A seam in a larger pattern. He was intercepting messages while she was alive, I said. Ruth did not answer the sentence directly. He was stepping into voice and sequence very early. I covered my eyes with one hand. Why didn't she tell me? Ruth took longer over that than over anything else. "Because telling you would have required her to manage both of you while she was dying," she said at last. And maybe she believed she could still contain him. The shame of that was so clean I could almost have admired it if it had belonged to another man. My wife dying, still translating and softening and rerouting while I mistook the house's survival for peace. After Ruth left, I took the typed update into the kitchen and read it 3 more times at the table. The radiator beneath the window clanked now and then with old building complaint. Outside, the rain let up and the streetlight came on in the wet dusk, turning the front walk slick and amber. I thought of Daniel in January, learning her phrasing. Learning not just words, but tone. Where to place practical matters, where to soften, where to lower me by implication while sounding merciful. By Sunday night, I was not calm. I was not certain either. Certainty remained just beyond reach, as though some decent habit of mind refused to let me call my own son a deliberate strategist without one piece more, one authority not rooted in paper and memory and neighbors' observations. I began to understand why such systems work. They do not need to erase reality. They need only to make reality exhausting to defend. Monday morning came cold and clear after rain. The sky over Bexley was a hard spring blue, the kind that makes bare branches look inked against it. I shaved carefully, dressed in clean slacks, and the navy sport coat Eleanor always said made me look less professorial than I was, and stood for a moment in the bedroom doorway before leaving. Her pillow remained smooth. The photograph on the dresser caught a square of early sun across the glass. I wanted badly, with a force that embarrassed me, to ask her what I was walking into. Instead, I went downstairs and found Daniel already in the kitchen. He had let himself in through the side door. The deadbolt on the front was still thrown, which meant he had come by the mudroom. He stood by the counter, pouring coffee into a travel mug, as if the house and I had long ago agreed that his access required no conversation. On the table lay a yellow legal pad with 3 columns drawn down the page. Sleep appetite memory lapses. He looked up and smiled. "Good. You're dressed." I stopped in the doorway. "What is that?" He glanced at the pad. "Just a few things to mention to Dr. Park. Helps to be concrete. Get that off my table." He capped the mug and gave me that same patient look he had used in the kitchen the morning of the memorial. "Dad, if we go in there combative, nobody wins." "We?" "Yes, we." I crossed the room, took the pad and read the first 3 entries. Asked same question twice about Monday appointment, misplaced electric bill. Confused dog food at memorial reception. For a second, I could not feel my fingertips. He reached for the pad. "Don't." I held it away from him. "You wrote that. I observed it. You engineered 2 of them." He exhaled. "This is exactly why I asked Mara to come." What? He held my gaze. She said you'd react like this. There it was again, the little poisoning of sequence. Make me reactive, then cite reactivity as proof. I folded the legal pad once, twice, and set it on the counter. Very carefully. You are not coming with me, I said. His face changed then, but not into surprise. Into calculation. That would be a mistake. It is not your mistake to judge. He leaned one hand on the table, lowering his voice. If you tell Dr. Park, I'm the problem after the week you've had, after what happened at the memorial, do you know how that's going to sound? I stared at him. He took one step closer, not threatening, merely intimate enough that I could smell his coffee. You are grieving, he said. You are exhausted, and you are angry with me. All of that is understandable, but if you start making accusations because you can't bear the possibility that you need help, they are going to hear exactly what I have been afraid they'd hear. It was the most frightening thing he had said to me because it contained no heat, only structure. I went to Dr. Park's office alone. The waiting room smelled of hand sanitizer, old magazines, and the faint citrus cleaner they used on the vinyl chairs. The television in the corner was on mute, with captions crawling under a morning show host smiling into catastrophe. A woman across from me coughed into a tissue. Behind the glass, Tasha at reception gave me an overbright hello and then an uncertain glance past my shoulder as if checking whether my family member had not yet arrived. No one's coming with me, I said. Her smile held a beat too long. All right, Mr. Weller. When Dr. Park came in 20 minutes later, she did not bring a clipboard first. She closed the exam room door and sat on the stool facing me, hands folded over her knee. That more than anything made me think she already knew this was not routine. How are you sleeping? She asked. Poorly. How are you eating? Enough to answer questions without fainting. One corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. Then she said, And how are you feeling about being here? Managed. She nodded once. That is fair. Doctor. Eleanor Park was a small woman with steady dark eyes and a way of listening that made many people say she was kind, though I think exact was the truer word. She had been Eleanor's doctor long enough to know when my wife was minimizing pain out of courtesy, which meant she had also known for years that I answered in complete sentences when cornered. There is dignity in being known by a physician who does not confuse that with evasion. She asked the usual questions first. Sleep, appetite, mood, medications. I answered plainly. Then she asked me to remember 3 words, draw a clock face, subtract 7s from 100, name the date and the building and the current president. I did all of it without difficulty, though my hand shook slightly on the clock because I resented the circle. Not the test itself, the context, the fact that I had been brought to it by other people's concern already sitting in the room like furniture. When she was done, she set the paper on the counter and did not write on it immediately. Mr. Weller, she said, I want to ask you something more open-ended. All right. Did you know your son had contacted my office more than once in recent weeks about concerns regarding your memory and daily functioning? It is a peculiar thing when a sentence confirms your fear and relieves it at the same time. I felt both at once so strongly I had to grip the arms of the chair. I knew about one appointment, I said. I did not know about more than that. She nodded slowly. There have been several calls, some from him directly, 1 or 2 through staff relays connected to your wife's chart before we closed it out. My mouth went dry. About me. Yes. I looked at the sink, the box of gloves, the mounted blood pressure cuff. Ordinary exam room things. They had never seemed accusatory before. What exactly, I asked, has my son been telling people, doctor? Park took a breath, and when she answered, her voice stayed neutral in that professional way that can itself become a form of mercy. He has expressed concern that you are repeating questions, mismanaging messages, becoming confused about appointments, and resisting help to a degree he finds unsafe. The word unsafe landed like an insult spoken in church. I am grieving, I said. Yes, she said. You are. I am not confused. She held my gaze. Nothing in today's assessment suggests a major cognitive disorder. I did not realize until then how hard I had been bracing for the opposite. My whole body loosened and then perversely began to shake. She saw it and let the silence hold. My wife died 2 weeks ago, I said at last. My son fed me dog food at her memorial and told the room I had mistaken it for pâté. Dr. Park did not flinch. She reached for the dark green mechanical pencil on the counter, rotated it once between her fingers, and set it back down without writing. Tell me exactly what happened. So I did. Not just the memorial, though, that was part of it. The calendar, the desk, the pen, the messages, the mailbox. Ruth Hanley's note about Daniel learning Eleanor's phrasing, Mara being asked to keep notes, the legal pad on my kitchen table that morning. I told it all in the plainest order I could manage because I had the sudden instinct stronger than embarrassment that if I strayed into rhetoric, I would sound like every story Daniel had already planted. Dr. Park listened without interruption. Once she asked, "And when was the first time you noticed an appointment or note entered in writing you did not recognize?" Once she asked, "Who handles your medications day to day?" And once when I mentioned the changed ink cartridge in Eleanor's pen, she tilted her head in a way that told me she understood the emotional scale of a clue some people might call trivial. When I finished, the exam room was very quiet. Finally, she said, "I want to be careful. Family conflict after a death can distort everyone. I know. But I also want to be equally careful not to let concerns communicated by relatives become the whole frame through which staff interpret a patient." She folded her hands. "And I am concerned that may have started happening here." A pulse beat once at the base of my throat. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, choosing each word, "that when a son repeatedly calls an office to describe a parent as forgetful, unsafe, resistant, overwhelmed, the office begins to arrange itself around that description unless someone interrupts the process." I heard in that not accusation but mechanism. A wheel already turning because Daniel had leaned his weight into it often enough. He was building something, I said. Her face did not change, but her answer came softer. He was shaping expectations. I sat very still. Then, "Doctor." Park reached for the paper with the clock face, and my answers on it, tapped it once with her finger, and said the sentence that collapsed what remained of the old shelter I had been standing under. "There is nothing in today's assessment that says what your son has been telling people." I sat in Dr. Park's exam room with my hands folded so tightly in my lap. The knuckles had gone pale, and for the first time since Eleanor died, grief moved aside and let something harder in. It was not rage. Rage would have been simpler. Rage would have allowed me to go home and strike some theatrical posture in my own doorway, point at Daniel's chest, and demand a confession from a man who had already shown me how quickly he could turn concern into cover. What came instead was a colder thing, a need for shape, for sequence, for enough proof that when he did what he always did, lowered his voice, widened his eyes, and made my pain sound like instability, it would fail. "Doctor." Park must have seen some change in my face because she leaned forward slightly and said, "Mr. Weller, I need to ask one more thing. Has your son had access to your appointment cards, medication list, or written reminders in the home?" I gave a short laugh that felt more like a cough. "He's had access to everything in the home. He calls it helping." She nodded once. "Then I want you to do something very simple. From now on, do not rely only on what appears where you expect it to appear. Keep one record in a place only you control. Dates, calls, changes, anything that seems off, nothing elaborate." "I've started doing that," I said. "Good." I looked at the paper on the counter with the clock face and the 3 remembered words written in my own hand. The roundness of the clock had stopped offending me. It was just a clock now, that more than her words steadied me. Daniel had wanted every ordinary test to arrive already carrying his interpretation. Here in this small white room with the muted television sound bleeding faintly through the wall, the ordinary thing had remained ordinary. The circle was a circle. The date was the date. My hand was my hand. "I need a copy of whatever he told you," I said. Dr. Park did not immediately answer. "I can document your concerns in the chart," she said, "and I can note that the current assessment does not support major cognitive impairment. As for prior communications, my office can release appropriate records through the standard process. Do that. I can start it today. There are moments when a man realizes that being treated like a competent adult by one person can restore more to him than comfort from 10. I nodded. When I stood to leave, Dr. Park said, "Do you have someone besides your son who can be present if you need support this week?" "Mara," I said. "My daughter." "Good." She hesitated. "And Mr. Weller, grief does make people vulnerable. That doesn't mean it makes them wrong." I thanked her and walked out through the waiting room with my coat over my arm and my old life arranged behind me in one direction and something meaner ahead in the other. The March sun outside was too bright after the office light. Cars moved along Main Street in their usual indifferent order. A woman with a stroller waited at the crosswalk. The world had the insolent look of a place where other people's families were still ordinary. I got into the car and sat with the engine off, both hands on the steering wheel, until my reflection in the windshield stopped looking like a man trying not to be seen. Then I drove home. The house looked the way it always had from the street. White clapboard, dark shutters. The porch Eleanor had insisted we repaint ourselves in 2008 because the painter's estimate offended her sense of what two healthy adults could still do. The maple out front just beginning to feather into leaf. I pulled into the drive and sat another moment looking at the kitchen windows. If a stranger had asked me then what frightened me, I might have said nothing at all. That was the particular dread of it. Nothing visible, no broken lock, no open curtain at the wrong hour, just a house whose meanings had started slipping under the weight of another person's hands. The front hall smelled faintly of furniture wax and the daffodils someone from church had left on Friday in a mason jar on the side table. I hung my coat, set my keys in the dish by the mirror, and stood listening. No voices, no movement upstairs, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the ticking clock over the mudroom door. Somewhere far back in the house, the dry little creak of settling lumber. The place sounded calm enough to mock me. I went first to the den. The lamp was off. Afternoon light lay across Eleanor's desk in a long pale bar that made every edge distinct. The writing tray sat where I had left it before the appointment. The outgoing mail stack lay centered on the blotter. The small glass dish held stamps, 6 of them face down. From across the room it all looked proper. I stood in the doorway and did not approach immediately. That had become part of the new discipline. Look before touching. Let the room speak first. When I finally crossed to the desk, I saw the change at once. The top envelope in the outgoing stack was one of the cream condolence note envelopes Eleanor used for family and church, not bills or ordinary post. I had left a utility bill on top that morning. More than that, the envelope flap lay a hair open, not enough to suggest tampering to anyone who did not know how Eleanor pressed each sealed flap flat with the side of her thumbnail. I lifted it gently. Inside was one of the thank you notes I had written Saturday night after the house quieted the note to the Millers for the lasagna and the white lilies. I had sealed it, stamped it, and set it for the mailbox. Now the stamp had been removed and replaced with another slightly crooked. My heartbeat sharpened. I set the envelope down exactly where I had found it and opened the desk drawer. The rows of cards and envelopes had shifted again. Not wildly, not enough to announce themselves. The family cards still left church right, but the older cream stock had been moved above the newer boxes, and the address book Eleanor kept tucked flat at the back was now turned spine out instead of flat down. Someone had tried, and not well enough. I closed the drawer and went into the kitchen. The message pad lay by the wall phone. The magnetic pencil was clipped to the side in Eleanor's way. The pantry calendar still hung half open with Monday's square visible. Below the appointment line in blue ink, someone had added, "Pick up RX before 4." I stared at the words until I felt the blood start behind my eyes. Not because I had no prescriptions to pick up, because RX was Daniel's shorthand. Eleanor had spelled out pharmacy or meds depending on her mood. Mara, with her legal work, wrote medication because she disliked abbreviations that looked like orders. Daniel, alone of the three of them, wrote RX on every godforsaken legal pad and home repair list and Christmas shopping note he ever made, as if life were a series of actionable items on a contractor's clipboard. I stood at the counter and let the realization settle. He was not just moving through the house. He was leaving himself in it. The side door opened behind me. I did not turn at once. Something in me wanted for one final second to be the kind of man who could still be surprised. Daniel set his keys on the mudroom shelf and said, "How'd it go?" I faced him. He took in my expression and closed the door quietly. He had not come dressed for drama. Khaki slacks, open-collared blue shirt, his leather portfolio under one arm. A man dropping in after work to check on his father. "Did you add that?" I said, and pointed to the calendar. He looked at it, then at me. "Probably." "Why?" "Don't do that?" "Do what?" "Pretend you don't know which things you've touched." He held my gaze for a moment. "I wanted to make sure you picked up your refill. I did not ask you to manage my refill. You didn't ask me to make the appointment either, and yet here we are." The softness in his voice had become by then its own form of contempt, not loud enough to quarrel with, calm enough to make any objection sound like poor emotional regulation. I crossed to the refrigerator and took out the water pitcher because my hands needed a task. "Dr. Park says there is no sign of major cognitive impairment." He leaned one shoulder against the mudroom trim. "That's good. That is all you have to say. What would you like me to say?" The glass in my hand clicked against the pitcher. I set them both down before I dropped something. "I would like you to explain the calls you've been making." He did not move. "I've been worried. That line is getting old. It doesn't become false because you dislike it. There was a time years ago when Daniel would have argued hot. At 16, he slammed doors hard enough to shake picture frames. At 22, he called me impossible in my own driveway because I told him his first apartment lease had 3 clauses no sane adult would sign without amendment. But age had not gentled him. It had professionalized him. He had learned that composure could do what temper couldn't: create witnesses in your favor before anyone had named the offense. "I know about February," I said. That caught a flicker from him. "Tiny, useful. What about it? Mara told me you called her, asked her to keep notes." He pushed off the door frame then and came farther into the kitchen, not in alarm, simply adjusting the geometry of the room. "I asked her to pay attention. There's a difference." "To what?" "To whether you were managing." I laughed once. "Managing, that's what I am now, a property." "Dad." "No, you don't get Dad right now." His face hardened by a degree. "You want the honest answer?" I looked at him. "Do you remember how to give one?" He ignored that. "Mom died. You stopped eating. You missed bills. You got turned around on calls. You started acting like the house itself was some sacred machine that couldn't survive a finger laid on it. And yes, I became concerned. The house was hers. It was also real life, and real life still needed running. There it was again. The old resentment cleaned up and made managerial, not grief at losing his mother. Annoyance that the world she ran had not transferred seamlessly into his own command. I said, "She did not ask you to replace her." Something happened in his eyes then. Not guilt, not exactly. Something more offensive. A sort of injured righteousness, as if my sentence had failed to appreciate the burden he had nobly taken on. "Nobody asked me," he said. "That's the point. Somebody had to." He left 10 minutes later, not because the conversation ended, but because he had extracted what he needed from it. My anger, my refusal, my continued lack of hard evidence in any form he could not recode as bereaved paranoia. When the side door shut behind him, the kitchen felt smaller, as if his calm had coated the surfaces. I went upstairs, took Eleanor's fountain pen from the drawer, and brought it down to the den. It is possible, I suppose, to overstate the transformation of an object in a story like this. I will try not to. The pen did not become magical. It became practical. That, in its way, was stranger. I sat at the desk under the lamp and opened the drawer where Eleanor kept the old shirt cloth for cleaning nibs. The cloth lay folded in quarters, soft from years of use. Beneath it in the back corner were 3 spare cartridges and a little bottle of blue-black ink she bought only when the store was out of cartridges. I loaded one of the older cartridges, the kind with the slightly darker flow, and wrote 5 lines on a scrap of paper. The nib steadied under my hand. The pen knew itself again once the right ink moved through it. I looked at the addressed condolence envelopes stacked in the tray, then at the utility bills on the side shelf, then at the outgoing note to the Millers with the changed stamp. By the time the lamp made a warm pool on the blotter and the rest of the room had darkened around me, I had decided on the first thing I would do, not as husband or father, but as witness. I took 3 of the ready-to-mail thank-you envelopes, and with the pen placed under each flap a tiny dot in the corner seam where no one would notice it unless looking specifically. Not large enough to show through, not enough to damage the paper, just a mark that would tell me whether the flap had been lifted and replaced. Then I took the utility bill that should have been on top of the stack and slid it back there, square and visible. I aligned the stamps in the dish 6 across. I placed the address book flat, not spine out. I positioned the writing tray a finger's width from the blotter's edge and set the pen cloth folded twice, not 4 times, in the left corner of the drawer. When I was done, I sat back and looked at the arrangement the way I used to look at a classroom before the students came in. Not lovingly, legibly. The next morning, Gerald Pike rapped twice on the screen of the side porch and came in carrying a thermos. "Coffee," he said. "Mine's bad enough to improve any situation by contrast." I let him in. The day was thin and windy. Light moved fast across the kitchen floor where the maple outside threw branch shadows against the linoleum. Gerald poured 2 cups into the old diner mugs Eleanor reserved for people who actually liked coffee and not dessert in liquid form. He watched me over the steam. "You look like a man who's grading papers after midnight," he said. "I'm older than that now. The midnight is inside me." He grunted at that, which in Gerald's language meant approval tinged with alarm. We took the mugs into the den because I wanted him to see the desk. He stood with his cap in his hands and listened while I showed him the changed envelope, the calendar entries, the organized drawer, the legal pad Daniel had left on Monday, which I had tucked away rather than throw out. Gerald did not interrupt. When I finished, he set his mug on the bookshelf and said, "You want me to watch the mailbox again?" "Yes, I can do that. And the side drive." "All right." He glanced toward the hall, lowering his voice, though no one else was in the house. "You think he's coming in here when you're out?" "I think he thinks he lives in the parts of the house that control information." Gerald took that in slowly. That sounds like a postmaster's worst child. It was such a strange, dry sentence that I nearly smiled. He looked around the den again, and I understood suddenly how it must appear to him, shelves of history books. Eleanor's lamp, the photograph of us at Hilton Head, the desk with its precise little systems. A room that had once meant the quiet labor of marriage and now meant evidence. "She was the one who did all this," he said softly. "Yes." He nodded. "I always thought so." There was no insult in it, only fact. Yet the fact cost me something, because I had always thought I honored Eleanor by admiring her competence. It had not occurred to me, not really, that the same competence had been shielding me from an ugliness in my own family I did not want to study. After Gerald left, I went to the hall closet off the front corridor and took down the archive boxes from the top shelf. Eleanor kept the family's paper history the way some people keep silver, not ostentatiously, but with order and respect. 3 lidded boxes, blue-gray board with white labels in her compressed hand. Calendars, correspondence, programs and announcements. I carried them one by one to the den and set them on the rug. Dust rose from the lids with that dry attic paper smell, though the boxes had never seen an attic. I sat cross-legged on the floor like a schoolboy and began with calendars. There are lives you can read only by memory and lives you can also read by paper. Ours had always been the second kind because Eleanor believed that if you did not write things down, sentiment would start lying to you before old age had the chance. As I leafed back through months and years of calendar pages, dental appointments, school concerts, church dinners, service calls, birthdays, Eleanor's mammograms, Daniel's contractor meetings, scribbled in later by phone, Mara's long Columbus weekends. I felt at first only the ache of continuity, the ordinary sorrow of days that had once seemed exhaustingly full and now looked as precious as stolen things. Then I reached the final year. The shift was subtle, not on every page, not enough to call immediate fraud, but there it was if you knew how to look. Added notes in the margins about Daniel bringing groceries. Asterisks beside my obligations that did not appear in Eleanor's earlier style. A change in the way missed calls were indicated. Eleanor had always drawn a little open circle beside names she needed to return. In the last months, some circles became check marks, the marks of tasks completed or delegated. On 3 pages, Daniel's name appeared not as visit or dinner, but simply Daniel here, as though his presence had become part of the household operating system rather than an event. I found 1 page from late January, with 2 entries on the same day, chemo 9 a.m. in Eleanor's hand, and beneath it, in darker ink and heavier pressure, Daniel handling calls. No mention of who had written the second line. No notation. Just assumption. I stared at it for so long, my knees began to ache on the rug. The programs and announcements box gave up its secrets more slowly. Church bulletins, memorial pamphlets from older funerals, wedding programs, menus from anniversaries, then tucked flat between the printed order for Eleanor's memorial and a church supper sign-up sheet, I found 3 drafts of Daniel's speech. He had written it out by hand first. That shocked me enough on its own. Daniel was not a man who drafted speeches longhand. But there they were on yellow legal paper, every line revised and recast towards some cleaner effect. Mom held us all together. She protected Dad from things he never liked to see. She taught me early that someone had to manage details when feelings got too big for the room. In the margin beside 1 sentence about me teaching nights and leaving Eleanor to carry the family calendar alone, he had written, "Too harsh. Soften." I sat back on my heels. He had known exactly what he was doing, not just in broad shape, in phrasing, degree, tone. How much pity to draw, how much burden to claim, how far to go before it looked indecent. I heard the front door then, and froze. Not because I was afraid in any melodramatic way, but because the den floor around me held too much open paper. The archive boxes, the speech drafts, the calendar pages. I stood too quickly, my knees protesting, and gathered the pages into 1 stack just as Daniel's voice carried down the hall. Dad, he came into the doorway with his portfolio and a paper pharmacy bag in 1 hand. He took in the room in 1 sweep. Boxes open, calendars on the rug, me standing with pages in my hand. "Cleaning," he said. The word might have been a question if anyone but Daniel had spoken it. "Reading," I said. His eyes went to the top page. I saw the exact instant he recognized his own handwriting. Again, only a flicker. Again, useful. "I was looking for Mom's garden club phone list," he said after a beat. "Thought it might be in one of those. In your speech drafts." He set the pharmacy bag slowly on the bookshelf. "You went through my papers. They were in my wife's memorial box." "Our wife," he said reflexively. And I hated him a little for the possessive grammar of it. I held up the page. "Too harsh. Soften." He did not speak. Outside wind scraped the bare branch over the gutter. The room smelled of paper dust and radiator heat and the stale remains of Gerald's bad coffee. Daniel looked not guilty, but inconvenienced. That was what made him frightening. He had prepared morally for this moment already. Perhaps many moments like it. It was a draft, he said at last. Of what? A eulogy? No, of a position. He gave a tiny shake of the head. You are determined to turn every ordinary thing into a prosecution. That would have worked on me a week earlier. Maybe even 3 days earlier. Now I looked at the legal paper margin note at the calendar pages where his presence thickened into authority and the sentence landed differently. Not as defense, as method. Why were you writing lines about protecting me from things I never liked to see? Because they were true. What things? He spread one hand, a gesture of exhausted explanation. Details, medical stuff, logistics. Mom knew it, Mara knew it, half the neighborhood knew it. The calmness of that, the little dragnet of consensus, tightened something in me so sharply I had to set the draft on the desk before I tore it. Get out of the room, I said. He blinked once. Excuse me. Get out of the room. His face cooled by another degree. You don't get to ban me from my mother's papers. I stepped between him and the boxes. Watch me. For the first time since the memorial, he looked not patient, but appraising, as though measuring whether escalation served him yet. Then quite deliberately, he smiled. It was a thin smile. Professional, the smile of a man who had just confirmed a diagnosis. All right, he said. But you need to think very carefully about what this is starting to look like. He picked up the pharmacy bag, left the portfolio by the chair as if claiming he would return, and walked out. When his car backed down the drive 10 minutes later, I stood at the den window and watched without moving the curtain. I was no longer guessing whether he would stop if told plainly what I saw. He would not. Plain speech to Daniel was merely one more piece of my instability to file. That night I called Mara. She answered on the second ring wind in the receiver. I'm leaving the office. Are you okay? No. A pause. Tell me. So I told her. The calendar pages, the memorial speech drafts, the margin note. Daniel walking into the den and finding me in the boxes. I read her word for word the line about someone having to manage details when feelings got too big for the room. When I was done, she said nothing for so long. I checked the phone screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Mara, I'm here. Well, her exhale shook. He used that line on me once. What line? Not those exact words. Same idea. Her voice had gone flat with memory. After Mom's third chemo round, when I said he was bulldozing everybody, he told me somebody had to handle facts because the rest of us were using tenderness as an excuse to avoid reality. I closed my eyes. He's been building an ethic out of this, she said. Not just making moves. He thinks he's right. Yes. Dad. More silence. Then quietly. I'm sorry. For what? For thinking this might still be grief-making patterns. I leaned back in Eleanor's desk chair and looked at the lamplight on the blotter. It would have been nicer if it were. I'm coming tomorrow. That went through me like both help and failure. I wanted her there. I hated needing her there. Those two truths had started living side by side too often. All right, I said. The most memorable scene of that week began after midnight. I had gone to bed with the boxes restacked in the hall closet and the speech drafts in the locked lower drawer of the desk. A key so old and little used, I had to oil it to turn. The house lay under that peculiar silence that is never complete in old places, pipes settling, radiator sighs, a car far off on Main, the soft ticking expansion of cooling wood. I had not been asleep long when I heard the sound. Not the furnace, not the branch. A measured scrape, paper against wood. My eyes opened in the dark. For a moment, I lay still, one hand on the blanket, listening. There it was again. Very faint. Downstairs. I got out of bed without turning on the lamp and crossed the hall in my socks. The upstairs floor under the runner gave its familiar 2 creaks outside Mara's old room and one outside the linen closet. At the top of the stairs, I stopped and looked down into the dark house. The den was not visible from there, only the front hall and a wedge of the living room. But from the hall below came the thinnest seam of light. Not lamplight, flashlight light, moving. I descended 1 stair at a time with my hand on the banister and the old wood cold under my palm. Halfway down, I heard another soft scrape, then the muffled click of a drawer eased almost shut. The seam of light shifted across the front hall runner. I should say here that I was afraid. Not horror film afraid, not nonsense. The fear was specific and humiliating. I was afraid that I would come upon some perfectly ordinary explanation, a flashlight, a dropped item Daniel or Mara, or even myself in some grief-fogged confusion, and that I would hear in my own pulse the proof that Daniel had been right to speak to doctors. That fear almost kept me on the stairs. Then the light went under the den door. I crossed the hall and put my hand on the knob. The room beyond was dark except for the narrow beam of a phone flashlight moving over Eleanor's desk. Daniel stood there in shirt sleeves, one hand on the lower drawer where I had locked the speech drafts, the other holding his phone low and angled. He turned at the sound of the door opening, and the flashlight beam swept across the room, catching the framed Hilton Head photograph, the edge of the chair, my bare hand on the knob. Neither of us spoke for a second. Then he said in the same calm tone he used in daylight, "You scared me." The absurdity of that nearly broke something in me. "What are you doing in the dark?" I said. He lowered the phone a fraction. "Looking for the pharmacy receipt. I thought I left it here." At 1 in the morning, I couldn't sleep, and that required a flashlight. His face in the weak glow looked younger and harder at once. Not wild, not caught, merely interrupted. "I didn't want to wake you." The lower drawer was still a 1/4 inch open under his hand. He did not remove it. I looked from the drawer to his face. "Step away from the desk, Dad. Step away." He held my gaze another moment, then slowly let the drawer ease shut and moved back. The click of the lock catching sounded louder than it should have in the dark room. I entered and turned on Eleanor's lamp. The yellow pool spread across the desk. The drawer fronts. Daniel's hand still holding the phone. He blinked once in the light. The room with its books and desk and framed family photographs should have become ordinary then. Instead, the lamp made the violation cleaner. He had been standing in my dead wife's den at 1 in the morning with a flashlight and his hand on a locked drawer. "You don't get to tell me this is concern anymore," I said. He did not answer. "You don't get to tell me I'm tired or off or overwhelmed or whatever polished little word you want to use next. You were in this room in the dark. I was trying not to wake you." "For what?" He looked at the desk, then back at me. "You have become fixated on paper, and you have become very brave around paper when the lights are out." Something like irritation flashed in him then, brief and before he covered it. "This is what I mean," he said. "Everything is turning dramatic because you need it to." I stepped closer to the desk, close enough to see where his thumb had left a print on the polished brass of the lower drawer keyhole. "No," I said, "everything was already dramatic. You just preferred it explained before anyone else could name it." That landed. I saw it. Not because he flinched, but because the stillness in him changed. He had been accustomed, I think, to my reluctance, to my instinct for preserving a room from ugliness. There in the den at 1 in the morning, with Eleanor's lamp between us, he understood perhaps for the first time that I had crossed some line he could not uncross by sounding patient. He slipped the phone into his pocket. "Get some sleep," he said, and walked out. I did not follow him. I stood alone in the den and looked at the desk, the lamp, the print at the lock, the open top drawer. He had likely searched before I came down. The room had become something new in that hour, not just evidence, not just memory, a contested place. He had entered it under cover of darkness, not because he was desperate exactly, but because he assumed the right to. The next morning I called Gerald, then Mara, then Ruth. Gerald came first, still in his cap, and listened while I showed him the print at the keyhole and described the scene. He stood with both hands in his jacket pockets and looked around the den with a retired postmaster's suspicion of unauthorized hands. "You want me here tonight?" he said. "Yes." "All right." Ruth arrived before lunch with a carton of soup and a face set for work rather than sympathy. When I told her about the drafts and the January update, she closed her eyes briefly and said I knew he was learning her voice. I did not know he was building a case file out of her fatigue. Mara came in just after 2, carrying her legal pad and a tote bag, and wearing the same expression she used when she walked into the hospital room the day Eleanor died, already braced against the worst thing, angry that bracing had been required. We spread everything on the den floor: calendar pages, the draft speech, the January update, the legal pad notes from my kitchen, my little envelope back logs from the past week, the changed appointment card, the pharmacy note. Ruth sat in Eleanor's reading chair and identified phrasing Daniel had lifted from church bulletins or from Eleanor's old update style. Mara made columns on her pad: object, date, original order, altered order, witness. Gerald added times by the mailbox, side door arrivals. Mornings he had seen Daniel's car before I was usually up. As the afternoon wore on, the room filled with an odd kind of energy, not warmth, not exactly solidarity, something more useful: shared method. At one point, Mara was comparing 2 calendar entries under the lamp, while Ruth read aloud from a church meal roster Daniel had once helped format. And I looked at them both. My daughter, with her wedding band, turned inward as she thought Ruth smoothing the edge of a page with her thumb, the way she did cards, and felt a grief so changed from the first week of widowhood that I hardly recognized it. I was mourning Eleanor now, not only as the woman who had loved me, but as the woman who had held this line of competence and decency in place long enough that her absence had to be studied like the missing beam in a house. "Dad," Mara said, and tapped a January page. "Look at this." I knelt beside her. On the calendar page for January 23rd, Eleanor's compressed hand listed Chemo 9, home by 1 rest. In the lower corner, in darker ink, had been added, "Call reroutes to Daniel." That alone would have been troubling enough. But on the reverse side of the page, visible faintly where the pen had pressed through, was a practice line written and half-scribbled out responses from the house delayed. I stared at the paper. "He rehearsed it," Mara said quietly. Ruth leaned in. Or wrote it once, then used a cleaner version later. Either way, the phrase had existed in the house before the church update, before the memorial, before the legal pad on my kitchen table. It had been part of his vocabulary for me while Eleanor was still alive. The moral pain of that arrived cleanly. He had not simply interpreted my grief after the fact. He had been preparing a language for my diminishment while his mother was still asking for blankets and anti-nausea tea and me. I stood up too fast and had to put a hand on the desk. "You all right?" Gerald asked. "No." Mara rose too. "Sit down." "No." I looked at the pages, then at the room. Then at the door to the hall through which Daniel had moved so many times, as if no threshold in the house had authority to stop him. No more sitting down. They all fell quiet. Because I think they heard in my voice what I heard too. Not theatrics, decision. I walked to the desk, opened the top drawer, and took out Eleanor's fountain pen. Ruth looked at it and then at me. "Tom." "I know." I uncapped it, tested the nib on scrap paper, and wrote in the margin of Mara's legal pad, "Front hall camera number, neighbors. Witnesses. Room matters." Mara gave me a tired, almost incredulous look. "You've moved fast. I've moved late." The pen sat easily in my fingers now. Not relic. Instrument. Its weight steadied me. I looked at the den, the lamp, the drawer, the threshold to the hall, the angle from which a person entering would see the desk first and the boxes second, the room where Eleanor had written notes for births, deaths, graduations, meals, illnesses, little acts by which a family announces what kind of people it is trying to be. The room Aniel had used as command center and then entered in darkness to keep curating the story. "This is where it ends," I said. Mara followed my gaze around the room and understood before I spoke again. "You want him here?" "Yes." "You want witnesses?" "Yes." Ruth nodded once, very small. "Good." Gerald shifted his cap in his hands. "You set the room. I'll bring the eyes." The strategic move came to me whole, then, not because I am clever, but because the house itself had finally offered a readable shape. If Daniel's power came from private correction and preemptive interpretation, then I needed the opposite visible sequence, shared observation, and the one room in which his counterfeit knowledge of Eleanor would expose him rather than protect him. I arranged the desk as he would not be able to resist touching it. 3 outgoing envelopes with my hidden underflap dots. The utility bill on top, the stamp dish 6 across, the address book flat, the old cream stock underneath the newer cards. I left the lower drawer, locked the speech drafts inside. I set the legal pad from my kitchen on the blotter, not hidden, but half under the tray as if I had not yet decided whether to keep it. I opened the hall closet and left the archive boxes on the top shelf where a man looking for them would see they had been returned, but not know what had been removed or copied. Then I turned to Mara. She stood by the French doors with her own pad against her chest, watching me with the grave, unwilling admiration children sometimes feel when their parents become at last fully adult in front of them. "Come tomorrow," I said. "I want him to do it in the right room." "Come tomorrow," I said. "I want him to do it in the right room." Mara looked at me for another second, then nodded once. Ruth gathered the January pages into a neat stack and slid them into a manila folder. Gerald put his cap back on and stood with the kind of quiet readiness I had once associated only with weather reports and funerals. Nobody said what all of us understood by then, that tomorrow was not a conversation. It was the end of something that had already been dying in this house longer than I had allowed myself to see. After they left, I did not sleep much. The house had become in those last days a place where every ordinary sound arrived carrying possibility. The click of the refrigerator, the settling tick in the hall wall after the furnace shut off, the scrape of a branch against the gutter over the side porch. I lay in bed and listened, not because I believed Daniel would come in again at 1 in the morning, but because I knew now that if he did, he would do it with the calm of a man rearranging his own cutlery drawer. That was the part of him I had finally come to fear most. Not his cruelty, his composure inside it. At 4:30 I gave up on sleep, got out of bed, and stood in the dark bedroom with my hand on the dresser. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the open closet and the lavender sachet Mara had found in one of Eleanor's sweater drawers and tucked back, perhaps thinking it might help. It did not help. It only made the air feel more like a person who was no longer breathing it. I went downstairs without turning on lights until I reached the kitchen. Dawn had not yet committed itself. The windows were black mirrors above the sink, and the yard beyond them was only suggestion. I filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and turned the burner low. The small blue flame came alive with a soft, dry whisper. Then I went into the den and switched on Eleanor's lamp. The yellow pool opened over the desk exactly as it had every night for years when she paid bills, wrote notes, or sat quietly with a cup of coffee and the church directory open under her hand. I stood there looking at the desk, the tray of outgoing envelopes, the glass dish with 6 stamps, the address book flat in its place, the legal pad half under the tray, the lower drawer locked, the fountain pen in my breast pocket where I had put it before bed, not hidden anymore, simply mine to carry. There are men who feel stronger when armed. I felt steadier because I had finally stopped trying to keep the house innocent. I made coffee and drank 1 cup at the kitchen table with the calendar in sight and my small log of dates folded in my pocket. Then I showered, shaved, put on a clean blue shirt, and dressed not in a coat and tie, but in the brown wool cardigan Eleanor liked, because it made me look, she said, like the sort of man a town ought to trust with parade routes and weather cancellations. I had not worn it since before she got sick. I put it on that morning because I wanted to stand in my own skin in my own house, looking like myself and not like a man dragged into proceedings by someone younger and more organized. By 9, the light in the den had gone from lamp yellow to a pale March brightness at the windows. Mara arrived first. She came in through the front door carrying her legal pad, her tote, and a bakery box because she never knew what to do with her hands when entering crisis and had inherited from Eleanor the belief that a box of something butter-based could improve dignity even when it could not improve circumstance. She hugged me in the front hall and held on half a second longer than was casual. "You all right?" she asked. "No," I said. "Good." The answer startled a breath of laughter out of me. "What do you mean, good?" "I mean, if you told me you were fine, I'd worry you'd started floating above the room." She stepped back and looked at my face. "You look awake." "I have moved beyond needing sleep. That's not a medical category. It is in this house." She set the bakery box in the kitchen and followed me into the den. I showed her the desk exactly as I had left it and the notes I wanted in her hand, rather than mine during the confrontation. Dates, times, the order of the drawer when we found it, the underflap dots, Dr. Park's assessment summary on the release note I had picked up the afternoon before, the photocopies she had helped me make from the calendar pages and Daniel's memorial drafts. She took them without speaking for a moment. Then she said quietly, "If he tries to turn this into your grief speaking, I want you to let me answer first." "No." She looked up. "Dad?" "No. I let too many people answer first already." Some emotion crossed her face, then pain perhaps, and something close to shame. She nodded once. "All right." Ruth arrived at 10 with a navy coat over her arm and the expression of a woman who had decided that politeness was no longer the highest available virtue. Gerald came 5 minutes after her, bringing a paper sack of store-bought donuts he clearly did not intend anyone to eat, and a folded sheet torn from a memo pad on which he had written the dates and times he remembered seeing Daniel at the mailbox and side drive. He placed it on the desk with all the gravity of a man swearing into court. We did not rehearse. I did not want rehearsed outrage. I wanted sequence witness and the room itself. At 10:30, I called Dr. Park's office. I did not reach her directly. I reached her nurse, then her after a wait long enough for my heart to remind me that courage and humiliation are cousins. I said only that I would be discussing a family matter involving her office's prior contacts with me, present in my home, that I had her release note, and that if she could spare 10 minutes by speaker at some point in the next hour, I would be grateful. There was a pause of paper moving on her end, and then Dr. Park came on and said, "Call me when everyone is there." Everyone. The words settled into the den like an empty chair waiting to be filled. At 11:20, the side door opened and shut. No one in the den moved. I stood by the desk with one hand resting lightly on the blotter. Mara sat in Eleanor's reading chair with her legal pad closed on her lap. Ruth occupied the straight-backed guest chair against the bookshelves. Gerald stood near the French doors, cap in hand, looking like a man attending the quietest church service of his life. We heard Daniel's footsteps in the kitchen. The refrigerator door opened-closed. A cupboard door. The small domestic sounds he always made to establish presence before speech. He called out, "Dad." I answered, "In here." A few seconds later, he appeared in the den doorway. He stopped when he saw the room. To his credit, the stop was brief. He recovered in one heartbeat and came in wearing a gray quarter-zip sweater and the expression of a man mildly surprised by company but ready to absorb it into his purposes. He held his keys in one hand and his leather portfolio in the other. He looked at Mara first, then Ruth, then Gerald, and finally at me. "What's going on?" "Close the door," I said. He stayed where he was. "Tom, close the door." The use of my first name in front of the others was so slight a transgression many people would not have heard it. But I heard it. So did Mara, her jaw set. Daniel sighed through his nose, shut the door behind him, and stood with one hand still on the knob. You've assembled a panel." "No," I said. "I've assembled witnesses." He gave a very small smile, then not because anything amused him, but because he recognized the phrase as theater and thought theater might help him. "All right," he said. "To what?" "To your mother's house," I said, "and what you have been doing in it." He shifted the portfolio from one hand to the other and glanced at the desk. The legal pad half under the tray caught his eye. So did the open folder of photocopies. Then he looked back at me and lowered his voice into concern. "I think this is a mistake. That is the first true thing you've said in days. Sit down. I'm not sitting for an ambush." "No," I said. "You're standing for a record." That silenced him for a beat. Then he looked at Mara. "You're part of this." "Yes," she said. Ruth said nothing. Gerald did not blink. Daniel set the portfolio on the floor by the chair nearest the hall, but did not sit. He folded his arms instead, the stance of a man willing to indulge a temporary mania so long as its audience remained uncertain. It would not remain uncertain. I picked up the top envelope from the outgoing stack and held it toward him. "What's this?" He glanced at it. An envelope. It was a utility bill on top of this stack yesterday. Now it is a thank you note to the Millers with a changed stamp. He did not answer immediately. "I mailed a couple things for you yesterday morning. I did not ask you to. You didn't need to." I looked at Ruth, then Gerald, then Mara, and finally back at Daniel. I marked the flap. That got the first real change from him. Not panic, not even surprise exactly. An inward tightening, a recognition that the room had already moved one step beyond where he expected. I slid my thumb under the corner seam and showed the tiny ink dot I had placed there with Eleanor's fountain pen. "This envelope was opened after I sealed it and before you mailed a couple of things." The stamp was removed and replaced. "Why?" He shrugged lightly. "Because it was crooked." Even Gerald let out a breath at that. Not a laugh. Worse. I set the envelope down and moved to the desk drawer. Opened it, took out the address book and laid it flat on the blotter. Yesterday morning this was spine out. Last night it was flat. You changed it. You're seriously doing this over a desk arrangement? No. I looked him straight in the face. I'm doing this over arrangement because arrangement is how you've been lying. The room went very still. Daniel's eyes flicked once to Mara, probably expecting some gesture of moderation from her. She gave him none. So he turned back to me and said, still soft, "Dad, this is exactly what I was afraid of." "No," I said. "This is what you were preparing." I took the legal pad from under the tray and opened it to the page he had left in my kitchen. Sleep, appetite. Memory lapses, asked same question twice about Monday appointment. Misplaced electric bill, confused dog food at memorial reception. I did not confuse dog food with pâté, I said. You fed it to me and then narrated the room. Tom. Do not interrupt me in Eleanor's room. That landed harder than I expected, perhaps, because the room itself heard it. Daniel's face changed for the first time in front of others. Not into rage, into offense. As though the den belonged to him enough that my naming it otherwise was bad manners. Mara spoke then not to rescue me, but to lay sequence under the room. Dad told Dr. Park what happened. I told him what you'd asked me in February. Ruth brought the January church updates. Gerald brought the mailbox times. We've spent yesterday and this morning checking dates, handwriting, phrasing, and access. Daniel turned to her with a look I had seen him use on junior contractors who had misunderstood a chain of command. Mara, you're a paralegal, not a detective? No, she said. I'm your sister, which should have mattered more to you than it did. For one instant, I thought he might lose the room by sheer contempt. Instead, he pulled back into himself, smoothed his tone, and looked at Ruth. What exactly do you think you're doing here? Ruth met his gaze calmly. Honoring your mother. Something in his mouth twitched. I opened the manila folder and drew out the January church update, Eleanor's draft clipped behind the typed version. I placed both on the blotter under the lamp. "This is your mother's hand," I said, touching the first page. "This is the typed version that went out. And this," I pointed to the added line, "is where responses from the house are delayed because Tom is not always tracking messages well these days." Daniel looked down at the pages, then up at me. She approved that. "No," Ruth said quietly. "She made me rewrite it kinda." He turned. "Excuse me," she said. She would not have Tom made into a problem people pity before he had earned it. The sentence hit the room like a dropped thing. For the first time since he entered, Daniel seemed to lose the immediate next move. Only for a second. But a second is a long time in a room where everyone is looking at the same truth. "You're misremembering," he said at last. Ruth did not raise her voice. "I am not." Mara opened her pad and flipped to a photocopy of the January 23rd calendar page. "And this," she said, holding it up, "is where your handwriting appears on the reverse impression line for responses from the house delayed, before the church update was even sent." Daniel laughed then. A little incredulous sound, too polished to be spontaneous. "You are all sitting in here comparing pen pressure now." "Yes," I said, "because you spent months learning how my wife wrote." His face emptied. I did not wait for his answer. I reached into my cardigan pocket and took out Eleanor's fountain pen. I laid it on the desk between us. Not dramatically, just visibly. The repaired gold nib caught the lamplight. "This was in her bedside drawer after she died," I said. "I loaded the last cartridge myself in February. When I opened it last week, someone had replaced that cartridge with a full one and used the pen to write notes on the calendar and envelope flaps. Notes she would never have written, in a pressure she never used." Daniel looked at the pen but did not touch it. "Why?" I said. He shrugged once. "Maybe because you didn't notice." The answer was so naked the room almost missed it. Gerald shifted his weight by the French doors. Mara's head came up sharply. Ruth inhaled through her nose. I stepped closer to the desk. "Say that again." Daniel met my eyes. "You asked why?" "I'm answering." His voice was still controlled, but the control had changed register. Less soothing now, more tired, more contemptuous, "because you don't notice enough to run this place anymore. There are lines a family hears only once before it understands itself differently forever." Mara stood up. "You don't get to say that in here." He looked at her. "Really? You want to pretend he's been fine. He has been grieving. He has been drifting." Daniel turned back to me. "Mom spent years compensating for what you refused to manage. Bills, calls, schedules, medical details. People trusted the house because she ran it. After she got sick, somebody had to step in. Somebody, I said, or you, same thing." There it was, not confession in the theatrical sense. Something uglier and more believable. Moral entitlement, the conviction that because he had judged me insufficient, any invasion that followed became duty. I lifted the memorial speech draft and read aloud, "Mom held us all together. She protected Dad from things he never liked to see." He did not move. Then I read the margin note. "Too harsh. Soften." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. Mara stared at him as though the face she had known for 43 years had just learned a new shape. "You drafted my erasure at your mother's memorial," I said. "No," he said. "I drafted a truthful account of what she carried. She carried you." That struck him. Not because it enraged him, because it named something he had built his whole adult dignity around not seeing. He took one step toward the desk. "That's your answer, isn't it? Whenever anyone competent enters a room, you call it being carried." "No," I said. "My answer is that your mother protected all of us from the part of you that turns usefulness into permission." The words came out plainer than I knew they were waiting to. He looked at me a long second. Then finally his mask collapsed. Not into shouting, not into some operatic villainy cheap enough to satisfy an audience. It collapsed into private contempt made public. The concern left his face all at once. What remained was the man Eleanor had apparently been softening for years, intelligent, efficient, and profoundly offended by any life that would not admit his authority. "You want plain truth," he said. "Fine." She was tired, Dad. Tired of making your life legible for you. Tired of translating everything into a form you could absorb without feeling criticized. Tired of pretending your decency was the same thing as strength. The room did not breathe. I heard Mara say his name once, low and warning. He ignored her. "She knew exactly what I was doing," he went on. "She asked for help. She trusted me with real things because I could handle real things. You think this is some campaign. It's what happens when one adult in a house accepts reality before the others do." Ruth stood then. "Do not put her inside your cruelty." He turned to her with an impatience he had stopped trying to hide. "You knew her at a card table after choir practice. I lived with the consequences." "No," I said. He looked back at me. "You lived off her competence and called it burden." Something like fury passed through him then, but it still did not rise. It sharpened instead. "That's rich. Coming from you." I put my hand on the desk. Felt the blotter under my palm, the faint worn groove where Eleanor's ring had tapped the wood over years, the steady weight of the pen nearby. The den had become the exact room it needed to be. Not a shrine, not a study, a chamber of sequence. Witness. House memory under light. "Gerald," I said without taking my eyes off Daniel. "Tell him what you saw." Gerald cleared his throat. "Saw you at the mailbox 3 times that I noted. Early, before Tom was usually down, taking mail out, reading it going back through the side door." Daniel scoffed lightly. "I was helping." "Without telling him," Gerald said. I turned slightly. "Ruth." She lifted the January update. "You asked me more than once during Eleanor's illness how to word family notes so they sounded like Mom. At the time, I thought you were trying to spare her effort. Now I know you were learning her voice." Daniel's jaw set. "Mara." My daughter's voice came out cleaner than I think she felt. "You asked me in February to start writing down Dad's mistakes in case we needed a record. You raised concern about him before the memorial, before Monday, before any of this week's conflict, and you told me it was for his protection." Daniel opened his mouth, but I raised my hand and he stopped. Not because he respected the gesture, because finally the room did. I reached for my phone on the desk, pressed speaker, and called Dr. Park. She answered on the 3rd ring. "This is Dr. Park." "Doctor," I said, "everyone is here." "All right." I set the phone beside the fountain pen on the blotter. "Would you repeat what you told me Monday? About my assessment and prior concerns communicated by my son." There was a brief pause, then her clear, careful voice filled the den. "My current assessment of Mr. Weller does not indicate major cognitive impairment. Prior to that assessment, our office had received multiple concern calls from a family member describing forgetfulness, confusion about appointments, resistance to help, and safety-related concerns. Those communications influenced the context in which follow-up was suggested. No one moved. Dr. Park continued, "I cannot adjudicate family motive. I can say that the level of concern reported to us is not supported by what I personally observed in Mr. Weller at his appointment." Daniel looked at the phone as though it had betrayed the ordinary rules of furniture. "Thank you," I said. When I ended the call, the silence that followed felt different from all the silences before it. It no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to the aftermath of spoken fact. Daniel let out a breath and rubbed once at his forehead with thumb and forefinger. The gesture was very nearly human, almost enough to make him look tired instead of monstrous. That, too, was part of the danger. He had always been most plausible when fatigue could masquerade as depth. "You've all decided what this is," he said. "No," I said. You decided what it was months ago. We've only named it." He looked at the desk, at the pen, at the papers under the lamp, then at me. "And what exactly do you think you've won?" It was a revealing question. Not what have you proved. What have you won? Because to Daniel, family had become not relationship but jurisdiction. I answered him as plainly as I could. My standing. My wife's name. This room. The right to live in my own house without being narrated by you. The contempt returned. "You think paper does that?" "No," I said. "Courage does. Paper just keeps men like you from talking over it. And when that wasn't enough, you humiliated me at her memorial and then tried to make the room remember it your way." He looked at me with open loathing now. "Because you never remember things your way unless someone else carries the details." And there it was. The oldest wound in the family stripped to bone. Not concern, not grief. His terror of any form of adulthood that did not look like his own. I felt unexpectedly no need to answer the assault itself. The room had already judged it. What mattered now was consequence. "Mara," I said without taking my eyes off Daniel. "Take the portfolio." Daniel moved then, fast enough to surprise me. He reached for it at the same moment she did, and for one ugly second I thought the whole scene would collapse into a physical scramble cheap enough to let him claim disorder again. But Gerald stepped between them, not dramatically, just with the old postman's solid body and a flat hand. "No," Gerald said. Daniel stopped.